Well, just keep talking.
Well, what else do you want me to say? Before we begin our family
Get
tree
real close.
taping, I want to point out these things. I have some national numbers here from organizations to which I belong, and if anybody wants full documentation on these people, all they have to do is contact the headquarters of this organization and give my national number, and they can get full documentation and full details. Daughters of 1812, my national number is 22665. 17th century colonial dames, my national number is 23312. Daughters of the American Revolution, my national number is 230.
Correction, 33.
Pardon me, 33040. I'm glad John's sitting here. Now, the men from whom I've established direct legitimate descent and have documented their service in the Revolution are as follows. So if you want all of that stuff, give them my number and you can get it. William Orr, Ephraim McLean, Watson Gentry, Archibald Campbell, William Miller, James Gillum Jr., Sam Cummins Sr., Lewis Harris, Balaam Ezell, Richard Reynolds, Isaac Gillespie, Thomas Gillespie, and Joe Britton Jr. Okay? Now,
That's it?
That's it.
It's January 1st, 1991. Elizabeth and I are the director-producer team on this, and Grandma here is the actor.
The star.
The star, that's right, the star and the actor. Okay, now Elizabeth's going to operate the camera, and here's what we'll do. First, we will just sort of, can you get this? I'll move it if you want me to.
Nope. You can move it a little. I'll move the camera. All right, it's all in.
Okay, we'll let that run for a few seconds. This is not all the information she has by any means, but we're going to start with this.
I'm going to just zoom in and kind of go across. Okay.
Okay, now, tell you what, Grandma. Tell us briefly about you, your brother, and your sister as far as when you were born and
All right.
who you're...
I was born at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, where my father was stationed during World War I, but I was immediately transported back to Tennessee and consider myself a Tennessean because that's where my family was from. My brother, Jack, as we call him, was born in Nashville. He was killed in a train car accident near Bessemer, Alabama, and he is buried at Lone Oak Cemetery in Lewisburg, Tennessee. Polly was born in Nashville. She still lives in Memphis, isn't buried anywhere at this point. My mother, Virginia McLean, was born in Marshall County, I think out near Yale, Tennessee. She's buried at Lone Oak Cemetery in Lewisburg on the lot with my father and my brother. Her parents, Miss Nanny Mae and William Watson McLean, also are buried at Lone Oak Cemetery. Miss Nanny Mae was from Chapel Hill, grew up there. Watt McLean, as they call William Watson, was born in Marshall County, I'm not sure exactly where, and he was a man of many parts. For one thing, he was head of a private school, Haynes McLean School, which was highly respectable, and its alumni had a 50 or 60 or some odd year reunion a few years ago. He also traded in livestock between Tennessee and Texas. He died. Oh, do you want me to tell when he died? Why he died? You don't want that
Briefly.
anecdote. Okay. He died because he got off his horse crooked some way, hit his foot, got an abscess. Doctor came to operate on the abscess, apparently with a dirty lance. He got blood poisoned and died after they cut off first his foot, then his leg. Okay. Jones Everett Orr, son of Ludelia Ann Jones and John Vincent Orr, was born at Mooresville, Tennessee, on the farm that had belonged to his great-grandfather, and he died in Nashville and is buried at Lone Oak Cemetery. He and my mother married in Lewisburg, Tennessee, right in 1918, okay. Ludelia Ann Jones, my grandmother, was born at the farm that we know of as the Sam Jones Farm. That was her parents' home. And she and my grandfather were married, I believe, over at my great-grandfather Thomas Orr's house. I know that's where they spent their honeymoon anyway.
Where's that?
It's over on the Silver Creek Road. It's where you got that fence rail. The house is still standing. You
Okay.
picked up a fence rail
Right.
there one time. Okay. They married there. However, after the honeymoon, her parents wouldn't let her go live with the bridegroom on a permanent arrangement for about a year because they said she was too young. Because she said she was 16 when she married. As I look at dates, I think she was 17, whatever. John, or my grandfather, was, I believe, 30 when he got married. And he grew up over at the Silver Creek farm and loved it dearly. He later bought the farm that had belonged to his grandfather, and that's the one at Morrisville we think of as the farm. Now, my grandmother, Miss Dealey, as she was called, her mother was Louisa Dorinda Flanagan. The Flanagan is spelled every way in the world in records of all kinds. You find it spelled Flanagan, Flanagan, all kinds of ways. And she got her, Miss Rendy, as she was called by all the black folks, was married to Edmund Jones, and he apparently suffered a ruptured something because, poor lady, she had to nurse him for years before he died. My grandmother said her daddy was doing something about lifting a wagon out of something and did something to his insides, and after that was in bed most of the time. I'll get to anecdotes about them later. Miss Minerva, that's my grandfather John Orr's mother, my grandfather just thought she was wonderful. He was crazy about his mother, and I have a little rocking chair upstairs that belonged to her, and I'm flattered to say he said I remind him of his mother, and that's why I gave it to him. I don't know why he liked her so well, but I remind him of her. And Thomas, her husband, was in the Confederate Army. I have a UDC line that goes through him, and we'll get to more details later about the particulars of her death, which are kind of interesting. Now to go over to these Zells. Sarah Jane Reynolds, and known as Sally, and James Brittany Zell, known as Brett, grew up almost like brother and sister. Their marriage seems rather incestuous. Her aunt and his uncle had no children, and so they asked, in her case a sister, no, in her case a brother, in his case a sister, could they lend them some children? They'd like to bring some up. And since the families apparently had a bounty of them, they said, sure, take a couple. So Sally and Brett were brought up together at the home of Uncle Brett Fulton, whose picture Susan has, in Chapel Hill. The house is burned since. And Brett, when he got grown, said to Sally, if you don't marry me, I'm going to Texas. And so she married him, and she always said she wondered if he would really have gone. And we'll never know. He was in the Confederate Army, another Confederate veteran. Okay, Susanna Gentry, she was William McLean's second wife. And she is buried, oh, I forgot to tell you where the Reynolds and all were buried. I'll tell you about them. Sally and Brett are buried in the old Ezell Cemetery, back of Brett Ezell's father's house, back of the Joe Ezell house, which is on the road between Unionville and Chapel Hill. And Katie knows where the cemetery is. And my mother has a little brother buried over in that same cemetery. And the last time I was there, it was fairly well kept. And when Katie and I went to the door to ask the homeowners if we could see the cemetery, they were delighted to see us because the woman said they'd heard this was the old Zell place and they knew nothing about these Zells. Anyway, they're buried there. Now, Susanna Gentry and William McLean. I actually am not sure where they're buried. I know where William's father's buried, and I know where the old Gentry Cemetery is, and perhaps they're in that. I'll have to look that up a little bit further. Louisa Dorinda Flanagan Jones, she and her husband Edmund Jones are in the old Haynes Cemetery. To get to that, you go past the old Sam Jones place, like you're going to Bryant Station. Down at the foot of a hill, you come to a crossroads. Take a left, go out there about a mile maybe, and on the left-hand side there's a very pretty little cemetery with most of the stones intact. A few of them are gone. But they're buried there along with some of their children, their little boy Robert, who died when he was, I think, 4, and other relatives. In fact, Edmund Jones' mother's buried over there, and her tombstone was standing when I was little, but it's gone now. Okay, Minerva Benson. Finding their graves is going to be the Dickens. I know how to get there. I took John there when he was a little boy. You remember the time we went up in the high bushes? To get to that, how can I tell you?
I have that on a map, don't I?
Yeah, it's in the old Vincent Cemetery. And so much for that. I think Minerva and Thomas incidentally were married at her father's house, which is the next farm over from the Sam Jones place. A cousin of ours named Garrett lives on the place. He lives in a rather modern bungalow, not more than 70 years old, down at the foot of the hill. But up on the very top of the hill is a house where Minerva grew up, and it's log inside. Go in and you see the logs, but if you look at the outside, it's been covered with some tacky green shingles. But that's where she grew up.
Who covered it?
I don't know.
Anyone who's going to be watching this?
I don't think so. Probably some of the Garretts, but they don't care. It's okay. It's
Okay.
been covered for years. I'll tell you one more thing about Louisa Duranda Flanagan. She was born in a house in what we know as the Bryant Lot, just off the old Mooresville Road. And when I was a little girl, you could still see the foundations of that house. My father showed them to me, but I don't think you can find them anymore. I have no idea. Edmund Jones was born up around Springfield. We'll get to his antecedents, which are quite interesting when we get to the next card.
Okay, now, what should we know about you and your siblings?
Well, I guess just where we were born and where my brother's buried. Polly and I aren't buried yet. What do you want to know? Well, okay, I grew up more or less in Nashville. I always say I grew up in Nashville, but I left to go off to school when I was 16 and never really got back except to visit occasionally after that. And my brother, how old would he have been? He was about 14, I guess, when we left Nashville. And Polly remembers living in Nashville, but since she's 8 years younger than I am, she more or less grew up in Bessemer, Alabama. And I went to the University of Alabama. I went to Union University very briefly, University of Alabama, and graduated from University of Missouri School of Journalism. Polly got married while she was still going to the University of Alabama. She met George Terry when he came to Bessemer to be a groomsman in his first cousin Joe Terry's wedding. And the Terrys asked if one of the groomsmen, if two of the groomsmen, in fact, could stay at our house. One was George Terry and one was Alex Dancy, I think, from Jackson. And so Polly and George, who happened to just have come out of the Navy, World War II, promptly got married. And they went on and finished school, and Polly graduated from the University of Alabama. Jack went to the University of Alabama rather briefly. Then he was in the Army in World War II, but he never went overseas. In fact, he was in a hospital most of the time. He had a ruptured appendix, and then he had something else wrong with him. And I don't guess Roger can remember. We went by to see him in a hospital in Texas when we were driving from California back to Alabama during World War II in our Model A Ford. And I don't know what else to tell you about us.
Okay. He was the oldest?
No, I was the oldest.
You were the oldest.
I was
He was
the oldest.
second?
He was 27 months younger than I was.
Okay.
Uh-huh. And probably was 8 years younger than I am.
How do you happen to be born in Maryland?
I just told you, my father was up there in the Army. He was stationed at Edgewood Arsenal during World War I.
What was he doing?
He was in the Chemical Warfare Division. I don't know what he did, but the Chemical Warfare Division, which they had in those days, was stationed there. And I know my mother told me, I think it was just before I was born, she went up to visit him, that they had a terrible scare that an alert that some big bunch of deadly chemical had broken loose, that a tank or something had ruptured, and that everybody had better evacuate quickly or die. And she said she jumped on the back of a wagon. They didn't even have too many automobiles in that day, and it turned out, I think it was a false alarm. But she had the flu. That was during the great huge flu epidemic of World War I, which killed, I think, more people than the war did probably. And she had the flu when I was born, and they really thought she was going to die. So as a result of all that, and then they thought perhaps she had tuberculosis, my two grandmothers promptly took me down to the farm at Mooresville, and I stayed there for 2 years. And I stayed there off and on most of the rest of the time.
Where were your parents?
In Nashville. I've never really understood this. I think my mother got smart. She just gave me to my grandmother and said, here's this baby, I'm sick, take the baby. And yeah, and I stayed there most of the time until I was 2 years old. And
Who took care of you?
my two grandmothers, and Suze Wilkes and Ella Wilkes.
Okay, who were your two
My
grandmothers?
two grandmothers were Miss Nanny Mae and Miss Dealey. Delia Ann Jones, and Nanny Mae Zell McLean.
And they
Okay.
happen to be living in the same place?
No, my grandmother McLean, who lived with us normally, lived with my parents normally, she just went on down there with the precious baby. And 2 or 3 things I remember, I can really remember way back They say I didn't learn to walk till I was 16 months old, which I'm sure was true, and that I finally learned when my nurse in Nashville, Minerva, I said for Minerva to take me somewhere, and she said, get up and go for yourself. You can walk as good as I can. So I did. But I can remember my grandfather carrying me down to the orchard on his shoulders, and I swear I don't think I could or would walk at the time, and picking a peach for me, and he'd keep getting peaches to see if I had one I liked. And I also remember he'd bring a pumpkin up to the house, and he had big horseshoe nails, and he had a wooden mallet that we'll get to Lewis Harris eventually, but way back in time, a person named Lewis Harris had made a wooden mallet. And this was a primitive pounder peg. My grandfather would sit me down on the living room floor and start the horseshoe nails in the pumpkin until they were so far in I couldn't pull them out, but a good bit sticking up, and then he'd give me the Lewis Harris mallet, and I'd sit there and pound nails into the pumpkin. I remember doing that just as well.
Okay, that was John Orr.
Uh-huh. And I can remember my grandmother, I used to think it was a goat wagon I was sleeping in, but it was that little trundle bed we have. I can remember being asleep in that with its legs up on the porch across from the 40-acre field. I was at 50. And my grandmother coming and picking me up. Again, I wouldn't walk. And carrying me to the fence to see if I wanted to see baby turkeys coming up.
Was that great grandma?
That was, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And I can also remember she took me down to the hen house and put an egg in my hand and told me to hold it real carefully, and I did, and a little chicken hatched out in my hand, and I thought that was just the best thing that ever happened. It was just great.
Okay, so that was on the farm.
On the farm at Mooresville. These things.
And that was Grandpa's family's place.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so his father and his mother lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he grew up.
That's where he grew up.
That's
He
the
and
farm in
Clyde and
Mooresville.
Rebecca, right.
Okay, and so when you went down there, your grandmother, who lived with you all in Nashville, went with you. Did she get along with?
Oh, my grandmother, as a matter of fact, yes, my grandmother McLean, I wish I were like her instead of like Miss Minerva if I'm like Miss Minerva. My grandmother McLean was somewhat like Melanie Wilkes in Gone with the Wind. You remember, Elizabeth, I was talking about Melanie, that I always wished I were like Melanie. She was always gracious, always kind. She was a lovely woman. And in Nashville, it was amazing the many plateau of society in which she functioned. She belonged to the Belmead Country Club, but she knew everybody up and down the scale. And she knew the Vanderbilt faculty people. And she was really a remarkable woman. Her father, though she'd been born right at the end of the war between the states, as I like to call it, he sent her to college. I don't know how much of a college it was. I think it was in Louisville, Kentucky. I've got to look that up. But she was rather educated. In fact, he sent all his children off to school, I think, except maybe Uncle Orville. I think he gave up on him. But, yeah, and so she and my grandmother all just got along fine. Or if there was any hard feeling, they kept it to themselves. One more thing about me being a baby on the farm, though. I vaguely remember this. I'm not sure whether I really remember it, as so many people told me. Once when my parents had come down to see me and quickly turned around and headed back to Nashville, their parting words were, don't let the baby fall out of the hammock. There was a hammock out in the yard, and don't let her put beans in her nose. And I did both before they'd gotten 2 miles away. I don't know what made them think I'd put a bean in my nose or where I'd get the bean. But I can remember, I either remember that or I've heard about it and know it.
Okay, so what happened after you were 2 years old?
Okay, they took me back to Nashville. In fact, I was there when my brother was born, and we lived in a rather peculiar arrangement. It's down right where Music Row is now on South Street. A woman named Mrs. Wilkes. When the war was over, just like the end of World War II, housing was short. Young men were coming home from the army, and there was not much place to stay. And so my parents had rented an upstairs apartment at Mrs. Wilkes. She had one of those big old houses. And Uncle Pat and Aunt Ed also arrived and lived with us.
Who were they?
Uncle Pat is Margaret Gerald here in Shelbyville's father. He's dead. He was my mother's first cousin. His mother was Virginia McLean. She was the sister of William Watson McLean. And she married John Bryant, and they lived across the road from my grandmother and grandfather McLean. And my grandfather McLean died when my mother was about 12 years old, and that left Mama and this little girl child and a farm and no man in the house. So Aunt Virgie, this family really just lends children out. Just sent Uncle Pat over. He was about maybe Thomas's age or a year older. He was about 15 maybe, I guess, to live over with his Aunt Nanny Mae and tend to things and be the man of the house. And he'd been living across the road anyway, so my mother always felt like Uncle Pat was her brother. That's why we call him Uncle Pat. And somewhere around, I hope I can find, I have some interesting letters my father and Uncle Pat wrote to each other before either one married, wondering whether they should get married or go to war first, what they should do. And they couldn't decide, but both of them did get married. And so Uncle Pat and Aunt Ed, her name was Edwina, showed up, and they lived with us too. So in this one little apartment, there was my mother, my father, my grandmother McLean, me, Uncle Pat, and Aunt Ed. Uncle Pat and Aunt Ed didn't stay very long. I don't know how long, but I think they slept on the back porch or something. But they moved shortly. And I remember the night my brother was born, my father used to sit me in his lap and rock me and either recite the Iliad in Greek or read it in Greek, I don't know which he did now, or read me the telephone directory. And he'd read me the telephone directory when he didn't want to fool with this, I think. I'd say, read to me. He'd say, all right, and he'd get the telephone directory and read it while he rocked me. And he'd sing me all these good songs about little Liza Jane and songs that some of them, and about bullfrog on the bank, bulldog on the bank, the bullfrog in the pool, and all those things. And so, we had a big lap rug that had fringe on it, and I'd chew the fringe and bite it up while I sang. I remember that. And he was rocking me one night, and he told me I had a little brother, and we could go down to the hospital to see him, and I wasn't real thrilled. I didn't care one way or the other. It wasn't something I'd been wanting Santa Claus to bring me particularly. So I remember when Jack was born. And of course I remember when Polly was born. Since I was 8 years old, I'd be retarded if I didn't. Okay, anything else you want to know before we move on to other generations?
Okay, so what, then you went off to college. Where'd you go to school?
Well, my grandmother tried to send me to St. Bernard Academy, which was a Catholic school very near where we lived. After we moved from Ms. Wilkes, we bought a house in the Hillsborough area. The house is still there, and I've ridden by it lately, and it's a nice looking little bitty house. It's small, but it was okay. And it was within an easy walk of St. Bernard. I think my grandmother McLean, who lived with us, figured she'd walk me to school. But they wouldn't take me because it was a Catholic school, and they said they had too many Catholic students and couldn't take a Protestant that didn't have room. So they sent me to Peabody Demonstration School, which is now University School. And I really liked it. It was considered extremely progressive at the time. I think my grandmother thought it might be dangerously so. But for instance, for arithmetic in the first grade, we all had paper money, which we'd made, coins cut out of cardboard and paper bills and everything, and we made change, and we brought orange crates, and we all had little stores and our merchandise, and we bought and sold, and we borrowed money at interest, and it really was a very good way to educate children, I guess, and we all learned to read, no problem there. And we began studying history with Tennessee history. That was our first. And we went on our field trips to places like Fort Niceboro, which hadn't been built at the time, but where the old Fort Niceboro used to be, and things of that sort. And it was interesting because Niceboro was full of people, well, full of the descendants of the original settlers, really. And some of the families had interesting connections. I was in school, not at Peabody, but at Ward Belmont with Peggy Dickinson, whose forebearer had been shot by Andrew Jackson in the duel. And I was also in the same class with Alice Overton, whose forebearer had been Andrew Jackson's law partner. So there were family connections that went way back. In fact, my cousin John Bransford married Helen Dickinson, who was descended from this same guy who was shot by Jackson. And we started French in the 4th grade. So I went to Peabody through the 6th grade. And then Mother said I had to go to Ward Belmont for at least a year. She'd been to Ward Belmont. And so in junior high school, she said, go a year. If you don't like it, you can change. So my best friend was Ann Howe. She's now Mrs. Josh Billings. So we decided we'd both go over to Ward Belmont. And we liked it well enough that I stayed there 4 years. I was president of the sophomore class, I remember. No, was I vice president? I was something. And then Ann said, let's go back to Peabody. So I said, okay. So we went back to Peabody and graduated there. So I kind of flipped back and forth.
And then from there, where'd you go to school?
Well, I was going to college when I was 16. My father was determined I go to Vanderbilt. And I had enrolled at Vanderbilt I had started rush week at Vanderbilt. I was really going to Vanderbilt, kicking and screaming. I was saying, I don't want to go to Vanderbilt. I want to leave town. I want to get away from home. I'm grown up. I'm 16. I want to go do stuff. And so they said no. And finally, I told my father, and this was true, guess who my faculty advisor is? And he said, who? And I said, Filthy McNasty. Well, Filthy's real name must have been something else, but McNasty was his real name. And I'd always heard my father talking about how he hated Filthy McNasty, what an idiot he was. He'd been one of my father's teachers, and my father just hated him. I said, Filthy McNasty, and it was true, is my faculty advisor. So he said, okay, you can go somewhere else. So he said, you can go to Union, where your Uncle Matt Summer is on the faculty. This was a Baptist school.
Is that in Jackson?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I went down there, and the first weekend I was there, I was campus. They had a rule that girls couldn't ride in cars, and I just didn't believe this was possible. So someone asked me to go riding, so I did. So I was campus for a month immediately. But I was kind of a star on the Union campus, did very well, got to be an SAE sponsor, and was president of this and that. But my big ambition was to go to the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And I had a strong feeling some of my Union credits, which were required there, much Baptist theology, a lot of that stuff. I was the grader for the Baptist Bible teacher, graded papers for all the preachers who were coming along. I had a feeling they weren't going to transfer very well. It turned out I was right. And so meantime, about that time, my parents moved to Bessemer, Alabama. So they said, okay, you can go to the University of Alabama. That was just about 45 miles from Bessemer, and I guess they figured I couldn't get into mischief. Besides, I was a year older. So I went down there, and I stayed there a year and a half. I guess it was. I'm a little confused. And then Alabama was going to the Rose Bowl, and my father said, well, you can do one of two things. You can either go to the Rose Bowl, or you can try to transfer to the University of Missouri. It cost about the same thing. So I said, I'll go to the University of Missouri, so I did.
Okay, and graduated there?
Oh yeah, I graduated there by the hardest. My credits were so mixed up by that time, I had to, as you heard me say, take a summer course or two at Birmingham Southern. I have credits all over the United States to make up some stuff that wouldn't transfer. And during my last semester, my senior year at Missouri, and I had to go to summer school at the University of Missouri one quarter. And then during the last semester of my senior year, I was told that I was short a credit in political science. And I said, I got 18 hours in political science. What are you talking about? And they said, well, it was Missouri state government that was required, University of Missouri. So I took that as a correspondence course while I was a student in residence to graduate. So that's my story. I didn't mean to take up so much time with me.
Nice. Now, let's see. Let's back up to your parents now.
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to know about them?
Well, I don't really know.
Where'd Grandma grow up?
Grandma grew up in Lewisburg, the petted and spoiled darling. I'll tell you the truth. She was the only child. She'd had an older brother, but he died immediately.
That's Robert?
No, her brother, I think, was named William, and he's buried over there at Eagleville, and he was either stillborn or died within hours. He just didn't live at all.
Okay.
And so she was the only child, and she was just absolutely petted to death, not only by her mama and daddy, but by the couple we know as Auntie and Uncle Matt. She was Emma Waters and he was Matt Summers, and they really weren't kin to us. But they had no children, and Auntie was my grandmother McLean's dearest friend. They were just chums. And so Auntie and Uncle Matt sort of semi-adopted mother, and she called them Auntie and Uncle Matt all the time, and they called her baby. And that's Auntie's little chest of drawers I have in my bedroom, and Susan has her dresser.
Auntie's the one who sends Susan cups.
No, that was Big Isabel. That's somebody not kin to us either. That's somebody
Okay.
else. But Mother's daddy was head of the school, which the better sort attended.
In Lewisburg?
Haynes McLean School.
Okay.
And which she said put somewhat of a burden on her, that she was always expected to behave perfectly and make better grades than anybody else, because it would be a shame if she didn't.
And that's where she went to school?
She went there till she was in high school. I don't know. I guess she went there till she graduated from high school and then went toward Belmont.
Okay, where was Grandma born?
Grandma, I said that further back, she was born in Marshall County out in the Yale community, I think. Grandpa McLean had a farm out there. That's where he hurt his foot that time. And she was born at that farm. The house isn't standing anymore.
So they lived on the farm and in Lewisburg?
I
Kinda
guess he
shuffled.
commuted. I reckon he rode his horse in every day. I never asked about that. I do know that in the wintertime, Mother would go in and stay with Auntie and Uncle Matt while she was going to school, so she wouldn't be in such bad weather going back and forth to school. But I'm sure Grandpa McLean, well, as a matter of fact, Grandpa McLean did have a house in Lewisburg, and it's still standing.
Where is it?
There's a little house. You don't remember where Sue and Brent McBride used to live? I'll just have to show it to you. It's not a big house at all.
Do you know what street it's on?
I know where it is, but I can't tell you the name of the street. And it's a small house, but he and Mama, that's what I call my grandmother McLean, lived there some. And now what else can I tell you about anything? Minerva Vincent is the one who died because she insisted on being packed in ice water so she could get the breaking out to go in and go to a party.
Okay, let's skip way over. Wait a minute, let's get back to Grandma.
Okay.
She was born in Marshall County.
Right.
Do you know in what year?
I've got all these dates and all these things.
Okay.
If I start looking up dates, we'll
Okay.
be forever. And then all my DAR
Okay, so
records.
her parents-
Yeah, she was actually born in 1896. I know that.
Okay, and her parents, Nanny Mae Azell McLean
Uh-huh.
and William Watson McLean,
Mhm.
lived on a farm in Marshall County.
Right.
Okay, and he ran a school and
Uh-huh.
farmed.
Right. And traded in livestock in a big way. He used to go to Texas. He had a partner in that, and they traded livestock back and forth in Texas. And Mother said he bought some property at Hereford, Texas, because he was thinking about maybe moving to Texas. But he died before he made this move. But he took Mother with him to Texas one time, and she used to tell me about, well, it sounded like the Wild West when she'd tell me about what she remembered from going to Texas when she was a little girl. It must have been about no later than 1905 when she
How'd they
went.
get down there?
They went on a train.
Is-
And-
So he owned land in Hereford?
Yeah, because outside
What
Hereford.
happened to it?
Well, now that's what Mother told me. I used to ought to check out that maybe he had the mineral rights. That he sold it, she thought, but she thought he might have kept mineral rights. I don't think he did, or somebody would have contacted the estate wanting to know something about it.
Mhm.
But he had some land there. And this is something that amazes me, how prosperous these people became, apparently, when they grew up in such hard times. I mean, Bridie Zell came out of the Confederate Army without a nickel to his name. I used to play money with his billfold that had thousands of dollars of Confederate money in it. And it was everything. And his barns were burned, and his stock was gone, and his fences were down. They'd used his house for a headquarters, so the house was standing. But he came back with nothing. And he wound up quite prosperous. Sent his children to college, was president of a bank, superintendent of the Sunday school. I mean, and I'm sure, I don't know too much about how William Watson McLean's family prospered during the Reconstruction, but I imagine it was hard times all around. And
Okay, how did William Watson McLean wind up married to Nanny Mae Zell?
well, she, I am sure, set her cap for him. She always said he was the best looking man she ever saw. And his picture is at Susan's, that large picture in the living room, and he is a very nice looking man. And Mama, that's my grandmother, she really had her eye on Watt McLean, I am sure. And I read Elizabeth, or she read, the story of their wedding, which is really interesting, how the couples from Lewisburg had a buggy race to the wedding. That's included in the wedding story. And who won, I've forgotten, and how much the wedding presents cost. My silver tea service in there was one of their wedding presents. I think they said it cost $75 or something like that.
Okay, so they got married
In
and
Chapel
lived on
Hill.
a farm
Mm-hmm.
in Marshall County.
Mhm.
They got married in Chapel Hill.
Mm-hmm. Her
Okay.
hometown.
His parents were William McLean and Susanna Gentry.
Yeah. Now,
And where did they come from?
Susanna Gentry, I took you when you were little one time with Mother. We went over to the old Gentry house. She grew up in a great two-story log house, which when we visited, it was over near Thick in that vicinity, near Caney Springs. And the old cemetery where all her ancestors buried is on your map, and it's out behind there. When we went to the place, the house was being used as a grain storage place or something, and it was full of rats. But a doctor in Lewisburg bought the house. Did I show that to you, Elizabeth, one day? And moved the house, logs and all the logs to Lewisburg, and reconstructed it. It's a fine looking house there now. The
That's
where
the house
Susanna
Susanna Gentry
grew up in.
in.
Now, the house William McLean grew up in burned down. It was out, well, I don't know how to tell you where it was, but it burned down years and years and years ago. It's
Okay.
long gone. Okay?
So William McLean, Susanna Gentry got married, and we'll get to that
Yeah.
later. And their son, William Watson McLean, lived on,
A farm near Yale.
okay, where'd that farm come from?
I guess he bought it. I have no idea. That's what I'm wondering, how all these people got so prosperous in a relatively short period of time. Because when Watt McLean died, he left my grandmother enough estate that she never had to worry about money. I don't mean she was rich, but she had an income every month. She loaned money to her brother-in-law, which he never paid back. That really made Mother mad. She paid for my dancing lessons. She paid for my music lessons. I remember she once gave my father an automobile. So since she lived with them, I don't think they charged her room and board, and she did these things, I think, to make up for the fact that she didn't pay room and board. And she may have helped pay my tuition at Ward Belmont or something, I don't know. So White McLean left her comfortably well off, as we say.
Okay, now what about her parents?
Miss Nanny Mae's parents?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, okay, I told you about them. They were the two that were taken home by aunt and uncle and grew up in Uncle Britt Fulton's house. Now, the house that belonged to Britt Ezell, James Britt Ezell's father, is still standing over on the Eagleville Chapel Hill Road, and it's a nice house, and I have a picture of it upstairs, and the Ezell family cemetery back of that contains the remains of Sally and Britt's parents and all kinds of other folks.
Okay.
It's an Ezell cemetery there. Sarah Jane Reynolds, she was from Marshall County, but I don't know exactly where her father lived. I've seen his father's family Bible, and that's one of the graves you want to look for, Elizabeth, the old Reynolds Cemetery.
Just a second. Let's get this in here again.
Okay. Okay, Sarah Jane Reynolds was the daughter, we'll get to this later, of James Madison Reynolds and
You got
Nancy
this?
Dunlap.
Okay, just a second. Let me run this down quickly again. Nancy Orr Anderson, Aunt Polly, Uncle Jack. Her parents, Jones Orr and Virginia McLean. And now we're kind of working down this line. Here's William Watson McLean, who is my grandmother's father, and then his wife, Nanny Mae Ezell. And now we're talking about, okay, he's the one who ran the school and was the farmer.
And stock trader.
Stock trader.
Livestock, not stock market.
Right, hurt his foot, had to have his leg amputated. But where did that happen?
I guess they're still living out there on that farm. They might
On
have been
his
at the
farm.
house in Lewisburg, yeah,
Okay.
in Murray County, Marshall County somewhere.
Okay. And now we're talking about, here's Britt Ezell and Sarah Jane Sally Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're talking about them. And then here is,
Let me mention something else about Britt Ezell. When you start looking up Confederate Army records, it's very tricky. I have it all sorted out, and I have a UDC line back to Britt Ezell, and also to Thomas Alexander Orr. That's United Daughters Confederacy. But there were first cousins in Chapel Hill. There was James Balaam Ezell and James Britton Ezell, and they were first cousins. And each one was named for a grandfather, the middle name, because old Britt descended from Joseph Britton and also from Balaam Ezell. So his first cousin was James Balaam. And they both joined the Confederate Army at practically the same time. So when you get to Confederate records, if you find a James B. Ezell from Chapel Hill, it's a little difficult to be sure which one it is. But I did find, with no problem at all, clearly stated, full name, that James Britton Ezell, when he showed up to join the Confederate Army, he was a volunteer, and it says where he enlisted and to whom he took his oath, I've forgotten who, but he arrived, it mentions, riding a horse valued at $150. So I guess that was a right good horse, probably, in that day and time. That's the reason they bothered to mention that he had brought a good horse with him. And then he re-enlisted. He served that term and re-enlisted. But they didn't mention his horse the second time. Something had happened to it, I guess.
okay, now where did James Brittany Zell and Sarah Jane Reynolds live after they were married?
They lived in Chapel Hill, and that's the house. It was a house that belonged to Uncle Brett Fulton. I guess he left it to these young people. And I have a picture of it upstairs. That house is burned. That's a house my mother felt about the way I felt about the farm in Lewisburg and Mooresville. She loved going to her grandfather's in Chapel Hill, and I don't think she was as petted as I was because they had so many more grandchildren they couldn't possibly have done it. But she really loved that place a whole lot. And Sarah Jane, I was telling Elizabeth about this, refugee, when we were watching Gone with the Wind, and Scarlett and all trying to escape Atlanta. Old Brett was off in the Confederate Army. He was young Brett at the time. Sarah Jane had a little girl too, and she was pregnant.
So they were married
Oh yeah.
when he joined the Army?
Yeah. And so she refugeed, as they say, to Social Circle, Georgia. And I've never figured out exactly why. Well, I do know why. Yeah, the Reynolds were in Social Circle. I know we'll get to them later as we go down her ancestry. Her great-grandfather, I believe, lived in Social Circle. I'll have to count back. So she must have had relatives there. Right into the path of the Union Army. And her second child was born in Social Circle. So poor young lady with these children, and she's the one who said she came back to Chapel Hill and found everything gone. Her husband wasn't back. Said no stock, no fences, no slaves, of course, no nothing. And that she sat down on the front porch and she just cried, and then she got up and went to work. So when I see Scarlett saying I'll never be hungry again, I think it might have been kind of like that, I don't know. But Britt came home safe and sound. Now William McLean was not in the Confederate Army or any army, and I don't know why. Edmund Jones may have been 4F because of his bad back. He was a little older than these other guys.
Okay, now you've jumped over now to my grandfather's side of the family.
Well, yeah, I'm just going across that line of men who might have been in the Confederate Army.
Okay.
Edmund Jones is the one who suffered all these agonies and had to stay in bed most of the time. But my grandmother said that Pa made shoes for the Confederate Army, which I guess he knew how to do because we have the little shoe he made for his little son Robert. Susan has it, I guess. And she said he made shoes for the Army. I don't know. He was not a very high-toned gentleman, I don't think. He was stingy as could be, but when we go down some more generations, you may understand why he was. He came from a hard-pressed background. And Thomas All, as I say, was in the Confederate Army. I don't know how long. I know he was in camp at Tullahoma for a while, because they got him answering present for duty there.
Okay, let's go over to your grandfather, John Vincent Orr.
Yeah.
Tell about him.
Well, he was a grand fella. I really thought a lot of my grandfather. I felt like he was great big. I don't know whether he was as big as I thought he was or not, but he looked big to me because I was little a lot of the time. I was grown by the time he died. And he came from a family with a whole lot of boys in it. I'll have to count them up sometime, but there was a whole bunch and not many girls. There was one little girl named, I think, Pearl, who I believe might have been a Mongoloid. She was one of the last ones in the litter born, and my grandmother always said you could tell looking at that baby there was something wrong with her. And she died when she was about 2 or 3, which is the way Mongoloids generally did. And she was born rather late in Miss Minerva's life, so I think that might have been what happened to that one. Then he had another sister, Panina, and one of his sisters married a McCord, and we got McCord relatives over at Carnesville, and one married a Pickens, and Dr. Pickens in Nashville, I believe it's Dave Pickens, his father was Dave anyway, he's our cousin, and I called him one time to find out if he had a picture of somebody I wanted, and he wasn't interested in knowing what I was talking about. But then the daughter, Betty, this Miss Minerva and her big mouth, I guess this is why I reminded my grandfather of. Miss Minerva, Betty was engaged to a McKibben, and her mother said, I'd rather see her dead than married to him. With that, she promptly died. So her mother felt real bad about it.
Okay, let's stop here for just a second.
Okay.
This group of people, for the time being, here's Grandma, her parents, Grandma's father's side of the family, grandma's mother's side of the family, and name the Civil War veterans who are on this.
Okay, and I
Britty Zell?
We're ready to start.
We're all
Yeah, Britty Zell and Thomas R. were both in the Confederate Army.
okay.
And
Edmund Jones made shoes.
Edmund Jones made shoes. Actually, as I say, he might have been 4F, hearing about his terrible problem he developed after he did something with a wagon and hurt himself. I don't know what William McLean's excuse was, what he was doing. But I wanted to add just a little bit more about Louisa Dorinda Flanagan. Her father, Robert Flanagan, who's not on the chart, was in the War of 1812, and he was at the Battle of New Orleans, as were several other people in the family, and drew a pension for it, so I'm told. I haven't checked that record yet. But I think when Louisa Dorinda got married, she may have married mostly just to get out of the house and take the burden of supporting herself off her daddy, who had gone broke. I always heard that he lost his farm because he co-signed a note for somebody and the other person skipped out, and he was left high and dry.
Is he the one buried under a tree?
Yeah, he's buried at
Yeah.
Colioca, right. He's
Now,
one.
where's he buried?
In Colioca.
Where?
I've forgotten the name of the church over there. It's as you're going toward Colioca, it's a red brick church, which is rather new, replacing an old one, and he's buried up there under a tree. That's right.
Okay, and his name?
Robert Flanagan.
Okay, and that's my great-grandmother's mother's father.
No, it's your great-great-grand. Yeah, your
No, it's my
great-grandmother's mother,
it's great-grandma's mother's father.
And his wife is buried off the Globe Road, off in that really remote place I've taken you to. It's on the cemetery map, and her tombstone simply says Mrs. Robert Flanagan. She was probably in Reasonable. But we won't get to all that till we go to the next generation.
Okay.
But about Miss Randy, as Louisa Dorinda was called, I'm not sure that it was a great love match when she married Edmund Jones. I really don't know exactly why she married him, but she said when he took her home to his house, this was Sam's house, at that time the front part of the house hadn't been built. It was just the kitchen wing, and it was a log cabin. And she said she went in there, and he had saddles and bridles hanging on the wall, and she told him she wasn't living in a place that looked like a stable. And she took all that and threw it out in the yard and said she took boiling water and threw it all over the walls and scrubbed the floor good before she'd move in. And she also told him, he said he'd go to town and get her a buggy. And she told him if he brought a buggy home, she wanted one with a top, because ladies didn't get sunburned. And so he went and came home with a buggy with no top, saved him a few dollars, and she said she never would get in it. She built hen's nests in it. But she was a hard-working woman. I have a blanket upstairs on the bed for which she spun the thread, dyed it, and wove the blanket on the loom that used to be in Sam's loom house. And she also told about spinning the thread, weaving the cloth, and making a suit for her father when I think she was 12 years old. So she knew how things were done.
Okay, where did Edmund Jones get the farm?
His mother, now I'll tell a little bit about this. His side of the family is really interesting. I guess you don't want me to go clear back into the John Haggard story at this stage, but his mother was Elizabeth Haggard, and her parents were killed by Indians in two separate interesting situations, and so she was left orphaned, she and her brothers. And I found up in fact, we found where they settled her father's estate, and they sold his rifle and flat iron and a few things, and kept one basket to keep the children's clothes in. These were little children.
Should we talk to the camera more?
No, if you say, okay.
No, that's okay.
And I found in the archives where Jesse Jones, who happened to be the father of Edmund Jones, had gotten assigned to him, farmed out, two of the little Haggard brothers. They were, what do you call it when somebody is apprentice, yeah. They were apprenticed to Jesse Jones. And I guess it's because the boys, they were all poor little orphans, had to do something. And I don't know whether this Jesse Jones met Elizabeth Haggard because he'd apprenticed her brothers, or whether he apprenticed her brothers because he already knew Elizabeth Haggard and had his eye on her. But since she was the youngest, I think it was the other way around. Anyway, he later married Elizabeth Haggard, and he and his brother Eli had a mill up at Springfield, and my grandmother said when she was a young girl there was still a place at Springfield called Jones Mill. But he died, and his widow, Elizabeth Haggard Jones, with her children decided to move down to Maury County because she had a brother living there.
And Edmund Jones was one of her children.
Yeah, and my grandmother said her daddy, being one of the older boys in the family, drove one of the wagons.
That was Edmund.
That he drove a wagon, and a little iron mortar and pestle my grandmother used to use, and I wish I knew where it was in that wagon. She said Pa drove the wagon that brought that down from his mother's housekeeping. And Polly and I found in Springfield where Jesse and Eli Jones at a sale had bought a small still and a quantity of corn. And we went home and told my grandmother we knew what they were fixing to do, and she just had a fit. Said, "Oh no, they wouldn't have made whiskey. No, 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 no. Of course they made whiskey. That's what they were doing." But the farm, Elizabeth Haggard Jones bought the farm. It's known as Sam's Farm.
She bought it?
She bought it for $800. I found that bill of sale somewhere,
Huh.
I think. Because it wasn't in Maury County, it was right on the line. So she had a brother named Edmund who lived over in Maury County, and that's why she settled there. And they really had it hard, though. After she bought the farm, I guess she didn't have much left, because you've heard me tell this story. John Vincent, Minerva's daddy, lived over on the next farm, the one the Garretts have now. And Edmund Jones, still just a boy, maybe Thomas's age, was taking grain to mill. And they didn't have a wagon. I don't know, I guess they'd sold their wagons to buy seed or something. I don't know what had become of their wagons. But he was taking it on a travois, you know, like Indians use, fork, stick on each side of a horse. And John Vincent, a grown man, came out and said, "Boy, why in the world are you taking that grain on a travois?" And he said, "Because we don't have a wagon." And he said, "Well, as long as John Vincent has a wagon, you're not going to do that." So John Vincent loaned him a wagon, and I don't know how long he had to use it. But I think that's kind of a little interesting anecdote to include there. And I won't go back to the, do you want me to go back?
So what happened to
Would
Elizabeth?
you like to scoot over so you're not staring direct into
No,
that
it's all right,
sun?
it's not bothering me.
It's glaring off your glasses and everything. That's
It's
just
okay.
straight. So
Elizabeth Haggard lived with her son, Edmund Jones. She had other children scouting around, including one child in Arkansas, and I think in the safety deposit box in Lewisburg, I have some correspondence about that child's heirs and assigns suing some of the family about something about somebody's estate, but I've forgotten what that is. She had a great number of children. One of her children was the mother of Cousin Mary Aldrich, whose doll is upstairs. The little doll upstairs named Mary. One of great-grandpa Edmund Jones' sisters married an Aldrich, and they had a daughter named Mary. And Mary wound up pregnant without a husband. And Polly and I, checking the dates, figure her lover may have been in the army. It was about wartime. Exactly. And anyway, it was so embarrassing that they sent her away from home, and Grandma Jones, who was her aunt-in-law, said, "Send her over and let me take care of her," because Grandma was a good woman. So Cousin Mary Aldrich came over, and she lived there at the house with Grandma Jones and all. And she had this
Wait a minute, Grandma Jones being...
Louisa Duranda Flanagan Jones.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It was her husband's sister's daughter.
Gotcha.
So, okay. Mary Aldrich came over and she had this baby, a little boy named Tommy. And my grandmother all could remember him, and they all lived there. And when Cousin Mary came, she brought her doll with her. She must have been pretty young, and I had the doll upstairs. Dale made a dress for it. The doll had no clothes when I rescued it. And Tommy Aldrich died when he was about, I don't know, 12, 13, 14. And he's buried over in Haynes Cemetery near Grandma Jones, and his mother's buried over there too. And nobody, Mammy said that Cousin Mary Aldrich never said who that child's father was. Maybe he was a married man, I don't know. Nobody ever knew who his father was. But Mammy said she could remember when Tommy died that she thinks he must have had a ruptured appendix from the symptoms. Something, a very sudden, terrible stomach ache and then high fever, and he died. So I just thought I'd throw that little thing in.
Okay, how long did Elizabeth Haggard live? When did
she
Edmund
lived
Jones become owner of the
on
farm?
the farm? Oh boy, well, I've got in my box here Elizabeth Haggard's dates, and her grave is over in Haynes Cemetery, but her tombstone is now gone. You could find a rock there for a tombstone when I was growing up, but the last time I was there, I couldn't find a sign of where Elizabeth Haggard's buried. I'll just right quickly mention in passing about her parents, because I might as well.
can I get you? Would you mind sliding over? Because we're getting all that all the way to the edge if you can.
All right.
If it's not uncomfortable, because
All right.
well, I don't know if that helped any.
All
I was
right.
trying to get the glare off your glasses, so when we look at this, we won't say, I wish you.
I have some sunglasses.
Oh, it's not bothering me. I took my glasses off.
No, that's okay. Really, that's fine.
I
I just
thought-
didn't want you to be uncomfortable
My
with it.
father was John Haggard from Virginia, and he leaves a wide path in the Davidson County Courthouse. He served in the militia, and he was what was known as an Indian spy, one of Castleman's spies. they called them that. They were later known as Indian Scouts in the West. But he was an expert Indian tracker and so forth.
This is Elizabeth Haggard's father.
Father, John Haggard. And
That's Edmund Jones's mother's father.
right.
Gotcha.
And he was married, his wife, I'm not sure which. According to one record I have, he was married to a Gibson, and according to another record, he was married to Elizabeth Mayfield. He could have had two wives, of course, one at a time. That wasn't unusual. But according to a woman over here in Lawrenceburg, claims she has the full documentation, he married a Mayfield. And the Mayfields, this seems rather reasonable, because they were famous Indian fighters around Nashville. As you go back there in early Nashville history, those Mayfields were some kind of Indian fighters. And in the stuff up at the courthouse, I found where John Haggard and a couple of Mayfield boys and John Brown were building a wolf trap out near where old Hillsboro is now, Leapers Fork. And the Indians attacked them, killed one of the Mayfields, but the rest of them got away. And we also have a suggestion that John Haggard and John Brown were brothers-in-law, that Brown had also married a Mayfield. So it seems likely they were all a family connection. But anyway, back to Mrs. Haggard. After she had these, I think it was 3 sons and the daughter Elizabeth, she was pregnant again. And she and her husband lived out at what's known as Brown's Fort, John Brown's station out there.
Okay, now wait a minute. Who are we talking about now?
We're talking about Edmund Jones' grandparents, the Haggards.
Okay, Edmund Jones's mother was Elizabeth Haggard.
And
now we're talking about her grandparents being John Haggard.
Parents.
Her parents being John Haggard
And somebody.
and somebody maybe a Mayfield.
Maybe a Gibson, yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, Mrs. Haggard, whatever her name might be, was pregnant again, and she was riding into Nashville to buy some fabric to make clothes for the baby. And I used to hear this from my grandmother, and then I found it documented in some stuff in Nashville. Not all the details, but most of them.
It's in a book up at Webb, I think.
Yeah, and she was, they were attacked by Indians, and all the party was killed except Miss Haggard, who was captured, and one man who fell off his horse and broke his leg and rolled off in the brush somewhere and hid. The Indians didn't notice him for some reason. And he gave the account of what happened, that they drove Mrs. Haggard around a post all night, and the next morning they split her open and threw the baby out. Well, in some source notes I gave Webb School that I bought from the archives, I bought a Xerox, it tells about this. Unfortunately, it doesn't give her maiden name, and that Mr. Haggard and the neighbors came and found the dead Mrs. Haggard and the fetus lying by the side of the road. Well, Mr. Haggard, already an experienced and effective Indian fighter, apparently went on the warpath killing Indians, because he was killed a few months later. And in Putnam's History of Tennessee, I think is the book, it mentions that John Haggard, they found his body, and it was a case of overkill, that the Indians didn't usually take it out on somebody dead, or maybe scalp, but that's about it. But it was assumed that maybe because he'd been killing the only good Indian's a dead Indian was his attitude, that the Indians rather overkilled him. But anyway, Elizabeth Haggard was the child of these people, and I'd love to do more research on her.
So who raised her?
Well, according to legend, but I've not been able to document it, she was probably sent to live with one of her father's brothers who lived in Kentucky. And once when I was in the DAR library in Washington, I looked in the Haggard file, and I found they had some family Bibles from Kentucky, Haggard ones, and I meant to thumb through them, but I didn't have time. The library was closing, and I may find some. Hey, John, something about this. Okay, shall we go on? Shall we
Okay,
go
so
right
now, how about Minerva Vincent and Thomas Alexander Orr?
Well, he apparently, now there again was a case of a guy who was really stuck on somebody.
Okay, now that is my grandfather's father's parents. Okay. Thomas Alexander Orr and Minerva Vincent. Where did Thomas Alexander Orr come from?
He was the son of Robert Orr and Polly Ann Cummings, and they lived on what is known as the farm in Mooresville. That was their house. They lived there. He grew up on that farm. And after he got grown, he bought the farm over at Silver Creek, where you took the fence rail, and his brother Sam took the farm at Mooresville. And his brother William died, and we've always heard he was killed in the Mexican War, and he's buried up here at Bear Creek. How they got his body back, I don't know. William was a teacher, taught school.
Okay, now wait a minute. William is who?
William was Thomas's brother. There were 3 boys
Okay.
in that family.
Okay.
And in fact, that piece of furniture right over there belonged to their mother's family. She had brought it down from Old Hillsborough. She came up at Old Hillsborough, and she brought that down to Mooresville, that piece that used to sit in Mammy's dining room. And there it is. Good thinking, Roger. And
Okay, so Thomas Orr was born on what we call the farm.
yeah, he was born there.
His parents owned that farm.
Right.
And his parents were who?
Robert Orr.
Robert
Polly
Orr
Ann Cummings.
and Polly Ann Cummings.
Right. And that was one of Polly's pieces of furniture she brought down from Old Hillsborough when she married
Roughly, when was he born?
Robert Orr.
Thomas.
Oh, Thomas. Wait a minute, one of them. Oh, I've got to, in the 1830s somewhere, 35, some odd
Okay,
like
he's a
that.
Civil War veteran.
Yeah, he was a Civil War veteran. He was
Okay, and he
Confederate
was
Army.
born out on the farm. Well, I'll be darned. Okay.
Yeah, and I have a book, some books that belong to his brother William, the teacher. I have Parson William's Life of Washington, and I have somebody's Life of Christopher Columbus, and I have a lock of William's hair up there in a frame, and I have a lock of Robert's hair up there in a frame. And
His brothers were William and Robert.
No, his father was Robert.
His
brothers
father
were
was Robert. His
William
brother
and
was
Samuel.
And Samuel. William and Samuel and Thomas were the children of
Right.
Robert.
Samuel never married. He was a captain in the Confederate Army and died in the old soldiers' home in Nashville. I understand drunk, that he became a heavy drinker in his declining years. And when
Who's the one who carved the famous pipe?
That's Uncle Anderson Vincent, Minerva's brother.
Okay.
I'll get to him in a minute. Boy, he was a sight. But Sam, Captain Sam, had a sword from the Confederate Army, and my grandmother used to give us a sword to take out in the yard and play. And Clyde Jr. has that sword now, Clyde Orr Jr., my first cousin.
Okay.
I guess. He had it when last heard from him, Captain Sam's sword. And Dick Stone, if you remember who Dick Stone was, Dick is my source for some interesting things. He told me, for instance, when Miss Robert Flanagan's buried, and I went back. He told me that Polly Ann Cummings Orr was very good with her slaves, that they all liked her real well, that she was really good to them, she knew how to manage things, worked out fine, and once they had an overseer, she found beating the slaves or something, and she took a whip and personally whipped him right off the place, though she was a very small woman.
That was on the farm.
Yeah, on the farm. And
So they had slaves on the farm.
oh sure,
Okay.
oh sure, and absolutely. Do you want me to get to Uncle Anderson Vincent? He's kind of an offshoot. He was Minerva Vincent's brother.
Okay, wait a minute. Now, so Thomas Alexander Orr was born on the farm.
Right. And his brother Sam and his brother William.
Okay, and he fought in the war.
He was in the army. Whether he fought or not, I can't tell you.
Okay, and then he came back and he just kind of lived on the farm until he
Right.
died?
No, he came back and Thomas bought the farm over at Silver Creek, and his brother Sam took the one at Mooresville. And
Okay.
then my grandfather
So
got it at
they
the
swapped
same
off
time.
kind of. Or he bought a new place and
A new
sold that
place.
place to his
Sold
brother,
his interest to his brother Sam.
who later died in the old soldiers' home?
Right. And my grandmother, by the way, said the first date she ever had with my grandfather, they'd been to a revival at Bear Creek, had attended it separately, and he asked her if he could escort her home. They were each riding horses.
Now, wait a minute. Your grandmother Orr.
Miss Dealey
Okay.
and John.
My great-grandma.
Yeah.
Okay. Said what?
He asked if he could escort her home from the revival.
Who did?
John Orr asked Miss Dealey.
Gotcha.
This was their first date.
Gotcha.
And she'd seen him before, but this is the first time he'd asked to court, sort of. So she was riding side saddle, and he was on a horse, and so...
She was about 15 and he was about
yeah,
30?
something like that. Well, he was 28 or 9, yeah. Well, to back up, she said first time she remembered seeing him, she had a sister about 2 years old, Aunt Amanda, Bill McKibben's grandmother. And a bunch of young men came to visit Aunt Amanda. And my grandfather was in the crowd. I don't know who the rest of them were. Or else they came to see my grandmother's older brother. She had some older brothers too. And my grandmother said she had on a new red dress at the time, and that she kind of kept hanging around in the living room because she kind of liked John Orr. She liked to look at him. And they kept saying, "Hey, little girl, get lost," or something. My sister did, or her brothers did. "What are you doing in here, kid?" or words to that effect. But she kept hanging around. But anyway, he then asked to escort her home from Bear Creek Church. So they rode along, and he said, "Now, I've got to stop by my Uncle Sam's place for a minute," that was the farm,
Mm-hmm.
"and see him about some business." and do you mind? And she said she rode up the drive, but she wouldn't get off a horse because she was so embarrassed. Here she was at this bachelor's house with no chaperone and no other women around, and she was just so embarrassed. She sat on the horse and hoped nobody would know she'd done this outlandish thing. That was the beginning of their courtship.
Wasn't she 17 and he was 30?
Well, she said she was 16 when they married and he was 30. But looking at the dates, I think she must have been 17, but I don't know for sure. But that's what she told me, she was 16. Any other questions here along about these people?
Okay, how about Minerva Vincent?
Well, Minerva was the daughter of this John Vincent and of his wife, Elizabeth Harris. And Elizabeth Harris was 16 when she got married. And John Vincent had been married before and had a daughter by his previous marriage. The first wife had died. So Elizabeth at 16 wound up with a husband and a stepdaughter. And then she had a whole raft of children. And one of them was the famous Uncle Anderson, who was a scapegrace, so to speak. Uncle Anderson was in the Confederate Army when he was a scapegrace. That means he was a cut-up, a rascal.
Okay.
And he was in the Confederate Army when he was 16. And he used to tell me about, and he was captured, and he used to tell me terrible stories about prison camp and how much.
Who is he?
He was Minerva's brother.
Okay, and you knew him.
Oh, sure. He's the one that carved the famous pipe, among other things.
You? Okay. He was your
Great-great-uncle.
father's mother's brother?
He was my great-great-uncle. Yeah.
And you knew the guy.
Oh, sure.
So that's Minerva Vincent Orr's brother.
Right, Uncle
Okay.
Anderson. And Uncle Anderson would tell these tales about being put in double harness with a calf, having to pull the garbage cart. How much of this is true, I don't know, but I always heard that when the war was over, he refused to take the oath of allegiance to the Union, flatly refused. And he wound up in jail. And down the road from Sam's, as you go back toward the farm, there's a pretty little house over on the, as you go toward the farm, on the left-hand side of the road that Willie Jones and his wife used to live in. Do you remember the little house? It's still there. It was on the Vincent farm. Well, I always heard John Vincent had to sell that little place to Edmund Jones, his neighbor, to raise money to get his son Anderson out of jail. And he had to get him out another time, Sam Jones told me. Sam told me that one time Uncle Anderson stole his brother-in-law Thomas Orr's horse. And he was pretty no good, I think. And I've forgotten, either John Vincent had to pay off Thomas for the horse or something, anyway.
Okay, so at one point, John Vincent, who is Minerva Vincent's father, was letting Edmund Jones use a wagon, and then later in time, Edmund had become more prosperous.
Much more prosperous.
So now he was buying something from John Vincent.
John Vincent, yeah.
Let me just show this sign again,
Okay.
so we see who we're talking
Yeah,
about.
Edmund Jones became real prosperous. I think he was pretty cheap, actually, close with the dog. But having grown up so hard, I guess he
There's Minerva
appreciated
Vincent.
money.
There's Edmund Jones. Edmund is the one who came with his mother and his brothers
Yeah, and sisters and everybody
sisters.
from Springfield.
His mother was Elizabeth Haggard, whose husband,
Jersey
whose
Jones.
father was John Haggard,
Uh-huh.
and whose mother was somebody who got cut open by the Indians.
Mm-hmm.
Minerva Vincent's father, John Vincent, was the one who let Edmund Jones use the wagon when Edmund was young, pulling grain with the travois. And now later, okay, and it's Minerva's brother,
Yeah.
who's the rakish Civil War veteran, who's a character. And Minerva's father, John Vincent, later sells something to Edmund Jones.
Sells a little house.
Sells a house, and that's the house you were talking
A
about.
little house that Willie Jones and his wife used to live in. It's a darling little house.
Okay, sold it to Edmund Jones to get money to either pay off the uncle for stealing the horse or
No, it was
whatever.
to get him out of jail because he wouldn't take the oath of
Okay.
allegiance to the Union. I don't know
Okay.
that Uncle Anderson ever took the oath of allegiance to the Union. I doubt that he did. He was an unreconstructed rebel. And in his declining years, he sat around whittling obscenities on the front porch. And he is buried up in that Vincent cemetery that where I took you that time. And well, it's on your map, so I reckon you can find it. Whatever. I used to tell Sam, leave me the Vincent cemetery. That's what I want you to remember. How I want you to remember me, and you will. But any more questions about these people down to this point?
Okay, your grandfather, John Orr,
Mm-hmm.
died under what circumstances?
He died, I think, the day I got married, I believe it was, or the day after or something. And I really feel bad about it. It's the only time my father ever got furious with me. My grandfather was dying. My father told me to come home. I said, no, I'm going to go get married. And my father really got mad about that. And I don't blame him, really. It was a terrible way I acted. But y'all wouldn't be here if I hadn't done it. Ray wouldn't have married me if I had gone to the funeral. But my father let me come home and see my grandfather, which I should have done, because my grandfather was really good to me, and he was an interesting man. He really was. His brothers were pretty well educated by standards of the day. Two of his brothers went to Vanderbilt Medical School. Finished Vanderbilt Medical School. It must have taken them 2 weeks. I don't know.
Who were they?
That was Uncle Billy Orr, William, and Uncle Robert Orr. And but my grandfather, I don't believe ever did go to school, because he was born, I believe he was 12 when the war ended. And he grew up in real hard times. Of course, he could read and write and figure, as they say, cipher. He was a real good businessman, and he was an excellent farmer. And he had no use for schools of agriculture. He used to talk about somebody who'd gone to UT Ag School and came home and tried to build a silo and just played the devil, is the way he put it. So he didn't have, I think, any formal education to speak of, though.
Okay. Let's see.
Now, I also have an arithmetic book that belonged to Thomas Orr and his brothers, Sam and William, that is so old in there that it has tables converting Virginia money into Massachusetts money, and in other words, before the Constitution was adopted. So I think that, I don't know whether that belonged to their mother or their father's family. Somebody in the family brought it up. One more thing about John Vincent, kind of interesting. He built a school. This, of course, before public schools existed, or private.
John Vincent being
Minerva's father.
Minerva's father. Let's.
He built a school on his property, hired a teacher,
Minerva's father.
and then he wrote the textbooks. And Uncle Bluford used to have the arithmetic book he wrote that was really interesting, the problems and his answers. He wrote a whole arithmetic book in longhand, of course, but it burned up when Uncle Blue's house burned.
Where was the school?
I don't know, it was somewhere on the Vincent farms. I say Kent Garrett has that farm now. Roger knows where the Garretts live, I reckon.
Okay, what about Louisa Dorinda Flanagan again now? That's my great-grandma's mother.
Right. And she's the one who threw boiling water on the walls because she said she wasn't going to live in a place that smelled like a stable.
Oh, okay. She is the one who married Edmund Jones, you think,
Right.
sort of, for what
I
reason?
always felt like, this is just my guess, well, it's things I think I heard my grandmother, I feel like it wasn't that she was swept off her feet so much as she felt like her father was dead broke and was having a tough time getting by, and the more children that got out of the house, the easier it would be on him. Now, I may be wrong.
Where was she from?
She was born over there in what's now the Bryant lot. And her father, Robert Flanagan. Robert came from Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where he came from. He joined the Army in Charlotte, and on his way to the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. And he never went home again. He just got back to Tennessee. He married a girl from Giles County and just stayed on.
So,
What house was on the Bryant line?
It was
Who lived
gone.
up there?
Grandma Jones was born out there, and it was long gone when I was a little girl. But when I was little, my father showed me where the foundations were. You can still see the foundations, but I'm sure I couldn't find them to save my life now.
well, those two farms then were right next to each other.
Right.
Here, wait a minute, let me,
Everybody in that whole county up and
Okay.
down the road were kin to each other. Everybody married everybody
you are
else.
saying that now wait a minute, okay, Louisa Dorinda Flanagan was born in a house in the Bryant lot,
Right.
which was Thomas Alexander Orr's, wait a minute,
Grandfather's place.
okay,
But
at that time, the Bryant lot did not belong to the Orr farm.
No.
That came later.
Uh-huh.
So in other words, Louisa Dorinda Flanagan was born on a farm that was right adjacent to the Orr farm.
Right.
And later we came to know it all as John Vincent Orr's farm.
Right. Uh-huh.
Because when he married great-grandma, is that when the two farms got hooked
No,
together?
I think he bought that. In fact, it may be that that's the farm Robert Flanagan lost when somebody skipped out and left him with that debt. As I say, I always heard he lost his farm because he signed somebody's note, and then they skipped out and he couldn't pay it and lost his farm.
So
Now,
where was my great-grandma living when she met John Vincent Orr?
she was living over at Sam's place.
Huh. So they jumped from the Bryant lot over to Edmund Jones's place, and then eventually she wound up back in the Bryant lot, basically.
Well, see, my grandmother, your great-grandmother, she was the daughter of Edmund Jones and Dorinda Flanagan. Edmund Jones had gotten this place from his mother, Elizabeth Haggard.
Right, that was Cousin Sam's
Yeah.
place.
Elizabeth Haggard, when she came down from Springfield, she bought that place, and I think it was for $800. I've seen the bill of sale.
Okay.
And that's where Edmund Jones grew up
Right.
after they got there. He kept growing up there.
He married Louisa Dorinda Flanagan,
Right.
who was living in the Bryant lot.
Unless they'd moved somewhere else by then. I don't know.
She was
her.
born in the Bryant lot
Yeah,
anyway.
born in the Bryant lot.
Okay, so my great-grandmother did not, she grew up at Cousin Sam's.
Right, that's where she grew up.
Gotcha.
Right.
But later wound up owning what her
Yeah,
grandparents had owned, being the
right,
Bryant lot.
Right.
Well, isn't that something?
Was it, you want to take just a break, Matt? I just noticed the switch on here was flipped kind of funny. I just want to make sure we're getting things okay.
Bring it in here, we'll
All right?
We need to speak to Bill.
rewind it a little
Yeah.
bit.
How long they're gonna stay.
Hey, Betsy Bob. One last thing about Miss Wendy, Louisa Dorinda Flanagan. I don't know why she didn't punch Grandpa Jones out completely. The reason my grandmother, her daughter, was named Delia is because the night before the baby was born, Grandpa Jones was out carousing around somewhere, came home and said, boy, he sure hadn't met a good-looking woman with pretty yellow hair. And her name was Delia, and if the baby was a girl, that's what he wanted to name her, because that was one good-looking woman. So Grandma Jones, like a fool, let him name the baby Delia. Really, true. I just can't understand that at
Did the
all.
right thing.
And one last thing about Grandma Jones, during the big war, she and a slave woman named Aunt Fanny were there by themselves with the children. Grandpa Jones, who knows, I don't know where he was. And all the stock was off somewhere. Well, some of the boys had driven it off somewhere to hide. Grandma said the Union Army came up. Well, I'm sure it was just a platoon or something or another came up, and they were going to burn the house. And she told them, they told her they wouldn't burn the house if she'd feed them. And she said she didn't have anything there but cornmeal. So she and Aunt Fanny made hoe cakes, Grandma said, for the whole Union Army. I doubt that it was that many, but that's one last story about her.
Okay.
I can go on back with much ado about all kinds of people, including the Britons and all sorts, but
Did we cover my grandmother's grandparents?
Sarah Jane and Britt, yeah, they're the two whose aunt and uncle took them in and
Okay.
left them the place.
Okay, and this is...
William Watson McLean.
Okay,
Right.
tell the story about how he died.
Well, as
Let me...
I-
This,
Okay.
we're over here
As I
now.
mentioned before.
This is my grandmother.
As I mentioned
This is
before,
her father, William Watson McLean. And she's going to tell about the circumstances of his death.
he must have been a very successful businessman because he left my grandmother comfortable, so to speak, and he had a school in Lewisburg. He was a farmer, had a farm out at Yale, and then he dealt in livestock back and forth between Texas and Tennessee. And he got off his horse one day when my mother was 12 and stepped down some way and hit his foot on a rock and bruised it badly or something, and it abscessed. And it got infected looking, festered, as they said in Yale. And my grandmother McLean said the doctor who came to treat it, she was sure had been working on somebody who had some terrible ailment and had not sterilized his tools because people never his instruments, because nobody did in that time much. So he lanced Grandpa's foot and he took blood poison. So the doctor came back and cut his foot off, and then he really had blood poison, so he came back and cut his leg off, and then he died. And
Where did all that cutting take place?
I suppose at Yale, I suppose at his house. In passing, I would mention one more thing about John Vincent, Minerva Vincent's father. He died in horrible circumstances. He rode his horse into his barn and forgot to duck and hit his head on the barn door and probably had a concussion. but he had a terrible headache, didn't feel well. They made the mistake of sending for a doctor. So the doctor came, threw him down on the kitchen table and bored a hole in his head, and he died. End of John Vincent. And he's buried in that same old Vincent cemetery.
You know where the Vincent Cemetery?
It's on the map.
It's on the map. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Now, do you want to go to Ray's family? I could just go on and on.
We'll get back to your side later. Let's now.
Ray ought to do this. He knows more about it than I do.
Well, why don't you get him in here?
Ray?
Well, Roger, can you focus in on this?
Yeah.
Grandpa, can you come in
Me,
here, please?
She can do it.
Oh, please.
Come on.
I see her.
Grandpa won't participate in this. He's busy.
He'd really like to, though.
Wait till I get down to the Reynolds and we find about the bastard begat upon the body of Mary Ann Gillespie by Reuben Reynolds. That's interesting. That's in the records of Franklin.
Could you come sit in here and listen?
No,
Off on the sidelines and
Can I make a statement that's off the record?
yes.
She knows it.
Hank's thinking about going in and getting little Caesars for everybody,
Mhm.
so we can have a family.
Sure. Is Hank gonna pay?
No.
He's a lawyer, isn't he?
I asked Ray for some money.
I mean, we'll help.
No, Grandpa's busy. Don't bother Grandpa.
You got
But
that?
I'm trying to figure out how much pizza
Both.
we need.
Well, I don't have the 50 cents, so I can
Hank's gonna write it.
So, man, where's
Hank's
little
gonna pay? Let's get
Yeah.
2 pizzas for everyone, because I like pizza for breakfast.
Caesar? You get like 8 for 888s, 2 for 888s.
Two
Yeah.
pizzas.
Hey, the Anderson family here, I'll kick in for
Make
one
sure you
side
get
of it.
What I'm trying to figure out is how many do you think we need?
Ray will read it.
Yeah, I know, but there's still a whole mess of
Just don't get olives or anchovies.
it. No anchovies.
Make sure you get one with just cheese.
Delphia's big on Little Caesar's Pizza. She can tell you all you need to know about one. And just take some money from
Make
her.
sure you just
Is this
get one with
focus?
just cheese, though.
You got this?
Okay, little.
I think so. Push to focus.
Okay.
What does that mean? I don't know. It's readable. It's
Okay.
like that other. I can.
Ray, you need to be in here so you can participate in the soundtrack. Seriously.
All right.
Okay. Now,
She knows it all.
now she doesn't know it all. For instance, that airplane, the airplane you claim you built, which you didn't. We need to know where that was purchased.
Here's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, this is for real now. Come on,
Yeah.
you're gonna have to tell us, was it Sears or Montgomery Ward that?
Okay,
Grandpa,
well,
tell me something interesting,
start in with
All right.
Ray and his siblings.
Okay, Ray was born in Rowan County, North Carolina, out around Enigville, or were you born in Kannapolis? You're born in Kannapolis. I thought you were born in Enigville. See, I don't know. And his siblings include the oldest child, Elizabeth. You have Elizabeth, you all must remember. And then James, you remember James. Then there was a child named Roy who died when he was quite small, between Ray and James. Then Ray,
How old was quite small?
Howell was quite small.
3 months.
Now, where was he? Came in. He was older than Ray or younger?
Older than Ray.
So you never knew him.
No,
Okay.
he'll meet him in the hereafter. And then Ray, and then Helen. And Ray's parents, Della Butler and Noah Stephen Anderson, and they are buried at China Grove, North Carolina, in the cemetery on the right-hand side of the road, and Elizabeth has pictures of the graves. Now, all of these graves we're going to talk about here, niece Elizabeth here, granddaughter Elizabeth to me, niece, daughter to you, niece to you, okay.
We know who.
Yeah, she got pictures of all of this and a lot of detail and directions how to get there. And Noah was born at Enigville, North Carolina. And the most interesting story I know about him I really like is when he and his brothers, Uncle Victor and Uncle Charlie, went to the revival in Enigville when they were young things and cut the ropes so that the tent came down on the preacher who was exhorting and on all the sinners waiting to be saved. And I just love that. I can't imagine Mr. Anderson doing that, but he did, he and his brothers. There you are, a fun kind. I did not know Mrs. Anderson, so I can't tell you anything about her except if Ray wants to contribute, but he won't do it. He won't contribute. Helen and Elizabeth both told me that she just spoiled Ray miserably.
Can't imagine.
That he was Mama's baby for her, and she really petted and spoiled him. And once when Elizabeth was pushing him in his buggy and he was having a screaming tantrum, a neighbor woman says hit him in the mouth. And Elizabeth went home and told her mother that the neighbor had suggested she hit Ray in the mouth. And Elizabeth said that her mother never spoke to that neighbor again. But there you are, another good idea gone to waste. And, so,
Okay,
That could have
now,
been the one thing that would have cured him. That would have been, changed everything.
right.
now, where was Ray born?
He was born in Rowan County, in Kannapolis. But
Born
on
in
the Rowan County
Kannapolis.
side, yeah, Kannapolis
Okay,
has a
now
county
why were they in
right there.
Kannapolis?
His father was working then, was he back at the, was he at the Cannon Mill or was he still working in
They had
Furniture?
just, they hadn't been in operation long.
Okay, his father was working for Cannon Mills.
So Cannon Mills was new at the time. This was pretty
Fairly
early.
new.
Yeah.
Not real new because Mr. Charlie Cannon's father had started it during the
Well, we're
Reconstruction.
talking about a matter of 25, 30 years there. That's new for a big company like that.
Okay.
Anyway, now, Noah Anderson's, let's go to the father's side first. 'cause
Now, wait a minute, now, what was he doing in Kannapolis
He was
at
working
Cannon
at
Mill?
Cannon Mills.
What was he doing?
I don't know.
He was a foreman of some sort, supervisor, foreman.
In some kind of spinning room or something.
Okay, how did he meet Ray's mother?
I have no idea. They met while they were,
Okay, we can't, there's no point in your talking since we can't hear
You
it.
can sit on that
You got
side.
Yeah.
of the camera, Raina.
Just,
they met while they were still living in Ennickville together as young people, long before he came to Kannapolis.
okay, they met in
It
Enid.
wasn't even a Kannapolis when they met, I don't believe.
So they met before the mill
Before
was
the
started.
town was started.
Okay,
The town grew up around the mill.
okay.
And your father had previously worked for a furniture manufacturer making furniture because he made that
Yeah.
furniture Helen
That
has.
was his primary.
Okay.
You know, I'm kind of slow picking up on this Cannonapolis.
I was,
No,
Kannapolis, it wasn't, there's no connection?
no connection. But I don't know why
What?
they named it Kannapolis. I don't know why they did it. It's just, I once when I worked at the
Yeah.
Independent, I did some research on that and I couldn't find anybody at all, no matter even people 100 years old, who had any idea why it was named that.
Well, did the town exist before the mill was there?
No.
Well, then it was like a Greek kind of, like,
Made canon Greekish maybe,
Right.
I don't know.
yeah. That's what I always
let's
thought.
go with that one.
Okay.
Kannapolis, had to be.
Anyway, Noah's daddy, I wish I had met this gentleman, James Gill Anderson. The Gill was his mother's maiden name. She was Jane Gill. And he was born in Scotland. And I have been told by elderly folk in the Ennickville area, in fact some of Ray's relatives, that he was a great reader. One of Ray's relatives on the Butler side of the family, no kin to old man Anderson, said that she remembered when she was real little that he had the greatest library, that she liked to go to his house. She'd never seen so many books. And I would like to know what became of his books and what the books included. I wish I knew, but nobody knows where the books are. And he was a graduate of the University of Aberdeen, I think. And Helen had his college yearbook. And she was hunting for it when we were there this last time, that she couldn't imagine what became of her grandfather's college yearbook. All the students have large beards, because he was in college way back yonder before the war between the states. And he had a brother, Stephen. Are you leaving?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, bye. Come back and see us. Bye. Come back.
John, we'll see you.
That's us. Okay. He had a brother, Stephen, who was a sea captain, because these the Andersons were from around Aberdeen, and Aberdeen is a big seaport town, still is. And there were three brothers, Stephen and Charles and James. James was the oldest one, incidentally. And Stephen, the sea captain, had gone back and forth to the United States. In fact, he became an American citizen. We have his citizenship papers framed hanging in the hall out here. And he persuaded his brothers to come to America. He thought it looked like something going on here, a good place. So they did come. Brother Charles settled around New York City and is buried in the same graveyard where Alexander Hamilton's buried. That little church down near Wall Street, I've forgotten the name of it. That little, in New York City.
So the next time I go to New York, I can find
That's right.
And
my
Charles,
great grandfather's brother's grave.
yeah, and he's buried in that cemetery with Alexander Hamilton. Not with him, but
The ransom money was supposed to have been paid in the Lindbergh kidnapping.
yeah, that was the cemetery where they met to pay off the ransom.
I'd be
And he
darned.
went
Yeah.
into the railroad business. Now, I don't know where these clippings are, but Mr. Anderson showed me real old newspaper clippings about his Uncle Charles. Charles became president of some kind of a railroad. Now, remember, this is before 1860 when
Did he
all this was
start?
going on. And he had a son who went to Mexico and became president of a railroad in Mexico. And every time I go to Mexico, which I don't lately, I look in the telephone directory for Andersons, and I've never found any, but I thought we might have some relatives in Mexico. And so much for Charles.
Well, you know, we really must have some
We might.
Mexican relatives.
We have
That's right.
cousin Carmelita.
Carmelita Anderson.
Rich Carmelita.
Yeah.
And,
Huh.
but as you read, John, you've read all those books about the railroad era in the West,
Right.
too. It was during this time. Now,
Now, when did they come over from Scotland?
we've got letters somewhere that your great-grandfather James wrote back to Scotland indicating when he came, and I don't know exactly. He was here shortly before the war.
Okay.
Okay.
1850s.
Something like that. He landed in Baltimore, or settled in Baltimore, and went into some kind of a business. I guess it was leather work, because he was a leather worker. And let me get Brother Stephen attended to, though, first. Stephen, I don't think, ever married. And Stephen was washed overboard on his ship, from his ship, and that was the end of him, in a storm.
When?
I don't know, but he
Where?
was washed overboard somewhere in the
With a
Atlantic.
monkey on his back.
With a monkey on his shoulder. He had a pet monkey, and the monkey was on his shoulder,
Why did that
according to
not
tradition.
surprise me?
And we found somewhere around here, you've got a letter his sister wrote saying, isn't it a shame that Brother Stephen died all alone? Well, he wasn't totally alone, he had a monkey with him. But
Who
some-
was the sister?
she stayed on in Scotland, and we visited her descendants when Ray and I went to Aberdeen. We went out and had dinner with her
Okay.
grandchildren.
What was her name?
What are their names? We've got that somewhere.
That's all in that big package of material.
Yeah, one of her daughters was a teacher, granddaughters was, yeah, well, the one we visited, her grandson had a printing business in Aberdeen.
They still have the business.
Yeah, and one of his children was a teacher, and one was planning to be a professional skier, though the family frowned on his plan, and I haven't heard about him winning the
Her
Olympics.
husband, one of your relatives by marriage, of course, was in the evacuation at Dunkirk, famous British.
Yeah, he told us all about that. That's a guy we went to dinner at his house. I'll have to look their names up. We wrote to them for a long time. I got back to Manhattan Beach, and I sent them some avocados because they couldn't get them in Scotland. They said they liked them.
Okay, so my grandfather's father was James Gill Anderson.
Mhm.
He had two brothers, Stephen,
Who washed overboard.
who washed overboard,
And Charles,
and
who's
Charles.
buried in New York.
Charles became a
Railroad
businessman,
person.
railroad man. He's buried up in New York.
Mhm.
And his
And-
son went to Mexico.
Mexico.
And had
We don't know what,
And we
Okay.
don't know what happened to him. He may have been wiped out in the revolution.
So his son would be my grandfather's
Nephew.
cousin.
No.
Your great-grandfather's nephew. He'd be your cousin. He'd be your third cousin, I guess. I'll have to figure that out. Okay. Now,
James Anderson's brother's son
He's your cousin.
would be Noah Anderson's
his
nephew.
first cousin and nephew. No, it'd be Noah Anderson's
No,
first
not
cousin.
nephew.
It'd be
Uncle.
his first cousin.
His first cousin. There you
Mhm,
go.
first
That's
cousin.
right. That
so
works.
your third cousin.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So, all right.
So the three brothers, Stephen Anderson, talked them into coming over,
Mhm.
leaving one
Charles.
sister.
I don't know. One sister we know of. There may have been two sisters. I'm not sure.
I think there were two and one died fairly early.
Anyway, he
You got all
left
that
siblings
down.
in Scotland.
Okay, so the three brothers came over prior to the Civil War,
Right.
and James landed in Baltimore.
Mhm. Set up a business. and
Leather
then-
work.
And then he joined the Union Army.
Okay.
Now, Ray, you always tell something here that we cannot document. You say that he was at Petersburg. We don't know he was at Petersburg. I have never checked his military record to know with what unit he served.
I think
I'm
I
going to
heard
do
that
that
from my dad.
sometime. Well, yeah.
Anyhow, James's big gold watch
Mm-hmm.
is the one that your James inherits.
Okay.
Because he's James Anderson, they wanted to stay in the Anderson.
James G. Anderson.
If possible, by
That's right.
descendant
Yeah.
under that name.
Okay.
Now,
Could you please just go on through this with
to go
So-
back another generation here.
stand a minute?
Charles Anderson had a leather works place in Aberdeen.
Charles Anderson is the father of James Gill Anderson.
And Jane Gill he married, and we went to Aberdeen and we found Anderson Lane, but we have no idea whether that's where the leather works was or not. We just don't know.
You let go, Mom.
And
There's James G. Anderson. Now we're talking about
James
Charles Anderson,
and
his
Jane-
father, and Jane Gill, his mother.
And we are told.
And this is in Scotland now,
Right.
in Aberdeen.
Now, we are told that they are buried, we were told, in Elgin. Ray and I went to Elgin. They've got a huge cemetery there full of Andersons and Gills, but we couldn't find these two. I went back again when George and Polly and I were at Inverness. I took a train over to Elgin for the day, and I did get a genealogist to see if she could track down their marriage date, and she did, and I gave your daddy for Christmas her findings. She has the place they were married. I guess it's in that box somewhere. And the date, and the interesting fact that James Gill Anderson was baptized the day his parents were married, which I think makes a kind of an interesting sidelight. But beyond that, we don't know anything about him.
Wait a minute, James Gill Anderson was baptized
The day his parents
the day
were
his
married.
parents were married. That means that he was born out of
Figure it out.
wedlock.
Wedlock, yes.
It's the B word.
But they made an honest child out of him. They got married.
I'll be darned.
There's one on each side of the family, as a matter of
As a
fact.
matter of fact, when we get to the Reynolds, we find a similar case. And so that's as far as we can go with the Andersons.
Was he the youngest brother, James Gill?
He was the oldest. They had James Gill.
He was
and
the
then-
oldest, okay.
Yeah,
that's-
and
okay.
they baptized him and
He was
got
the
married.
first one.
Yeah, and then
Gotcha.
they had some more children, quite a
Okay.
few. And now, let us go to.
Okay, now wait a minute. So we have Charles married Jane Gill. Do you know any more about Charles and Jane Gill?
Nothing except Charles had a leatherworks business, and apparently his boys had been brought up in the shop learning to do leatherwork because James Gill, when he got to this country, after he got out of the Union Army, he went on down to North Carolina, married Millie Shue, whom we'll get to in a minute, and for a while he had a leatherworks over at Mount Pleasant, North Carolina. And Ray and I went to Mount Pleasant and found some traces of his business there. He'd have a leather
No pun
business
intended.
there. Yeah. Okay.
Traces, leatherwork.
Oh.
Shall I
traces.
tell them about the lynching?
Yeah.
Well, we heard this in Mount Pleasant. People said, oh yeah, they knew about James Anderson and his leather business. That one time during the Reconstruction, there was a lynching there, a black gentleman, and the township got James G. to tan the hide. I don't know what they did.
Oh.
Wouldn't you like to have that?
Oh, gosh.
So, well, you said you wanted to hear about it. But whether this is true or false, I cannot tell you.
I would
It's
like
just
to
one
have
of
a
the legends. in
motorcycle
my-
seat cover made out of that.
No, Ray
Would
never
that get
heard it.
respect at rallies or what?
It's not something, that's something they talk
Pair of
about.
chaps, I take the legs
The
of the
chaps.
Okay, now, let's go over to Millie
Get
Shue.
respect.
Now, Elizabeth again in her film has pictures of where these various persons are buried. Now we get over to Millie Shue. Her real name was Amelia. She was named for her grandmother, who was named Amelia. And there were a number of people in the Shue family. When we were up there this last time, we found traces of numbers of them. She had a brother named Levi. She had a sister named Elizabeth. But
So James the leather man married a woman named Shue?
no, this is the other side of the family.
No, I
He
know.
did.
He-
That's true, he did. Yeah. And that's true, he really did. He married Millie Shue.
Okay, James Anderson married Millie Shue.
And he worked in leather, that's true, he really did.
Hmm.
That's, her name was Amelia, and they called her Millie.
Amelia?
Amelia.
How do you spell that?
Amelia.
Just like
Very
Amelia.
pretty name. She's named for her grandmother, who's in some of those papers we have there.
Which, okay, her grandmother being Henry Shue's
Mother.
mother.
Yeah.
Henry the German.
No, Henry the German goes back a few generations. Now, her daddy, Henry Shue, married someone named Esther, whose name we've not been able to pin down, though I think I could find it in the Concord courthouse if I went back again. He was in the Confederate Army.
Henry Shue,
Uh-huh.
also known as John H. Shue
Yeah, he's John H. Shue.
Jr.
And he was killed at the Battle of Petersburg. Actually, when you look at the record, they say he was killed at something church, but it was during the explosion of the crater at Petersburg. and blown sky high, so he's not buried anywhere. He's just sprinkled around one county in Virginia.
But he was already married and had a child.
Oh yeah,
at
he
the
was
time.
35 years old, I think, when he joined the army. Yeah, he not only had a child, he had a bunch of them. Let me get these Anderson things here a minute and tell you some more about them, yeah. Because we know a lot more about these people. He was born, John Henry Jr. He was born December 6, 1826, and went to glory March 9th, 1863. And he was married to Esther somebody. And his father was John H. Shue Sr., John Henry, and his wife was named Amelia. And we haven't gotten her maiden name down here, though perhaps we found it when we went to Annapolis last time, and I know I could find it next time I go. If I
Okay.
ever get
Where was
back.
Henry Shue born?
What county would that be? Around Mount Pleasant?
Yeah, but I don't know the county.
Well, these Henry Shue Jr., of course, who was blown up. We don't know where he's buried. We couldn't find. I mean, he's just scattered. We don't know where Esther's buried, but his father and mother are buried at a church. Elizabeth and all of us visited this last time. It's out in the country, away from Mount Pleasant. But Elizabeth has on her video cassette the name of the church, the picture of the grave, and how you get there.
Okay.
Now that's John Henry Sr. and his wife Amelia. Okay.
Okay, so now what did Henry Shue do other than, what did he do?
Farmers,
Okay.
all of them farmers. And we have not yet found the graves of, but perhaps we will, of the first Henry Shue. He was known as Henry the German. Henry the German, he's actually in some records as Henry the German, county records. He was born June 12, 1770, we imagine in Germany, and died May 22nd, 1860. And in his will, he left some, no, it was his son's will, left stuff to little Nellie, Ray's grandmother.
Okay, now Henry the German was Henry Shue's grandfather?
The Henry of the Confederate Army, his grandfather.
Okay. So who was Henry the German's son?
Henry the German's son was John Henry Shue Sr.
Okay.
And Henry, or John H. Jr. was his son, who got blown up at Petersburg.
Okay, and they all lived kind of in the same part of North
Right,
Carolina?
and when we were up there,
Near
it's near,
Concord.
Near Concord.
near Mount Pleasant. And,
Well, I'm saying though, Mount
yeah.
Pleasant is near Concord.
Oh,
and Henry
okay.
Shue's, the eldest, Henry the German's wife, was Catherine Herge, H-E-R-G-E, which sounds German also. And while we were up there this last time, riding down the road, hunting for the cemetery, we stopped a man on a tractor. And he introduced himself, and he had a German name. And so I said to him, I have always wondered why there's so many German people in this section of North Carolina. And he said, well, he could tell me exactly. That in fact, one of his forebears had donated the ground this church and cemetery stand on, where John H. Sr. is buried. He said that they came from the Rhineland section of Germany. A whole bunch of Germans decided to pack up and move. And everybody in the neighborhood packed up and moved. And they first went to Pennsylvania, and they thought the weather was too cold, and they didn't like it there. So they moved on, kept drifting south, and when they hit this little county in North Carolina, it looked very much like the area of the Rhineland from which they'd come, and the weather was similar, so they stayed. And there were Germans right and left there.
When was that?
Well, since this guy was born in 1770, I figured he probably didn't emigrate till he was 20 years, unless his mother and father brought him. I don't know, he may have come with his mother and father.
Late 18th century?
I think,
Okay, and that's Henry the German.
mm-hmm,
So he was born in Germany,
I would think.
immigrated.
Hmm.
Are you thirsty?
No, I'm just choking as usual.
Oh.
Yeah, and when I worked at the Independent, I did a lot of research on the history of the area, because, you know, it interests me. And up at Enochville, there's some of the tombstones are in German at some of those old churches. And it was a legend around there that some of those guys were Hessian soldiers who had been hired out by their German prince to go fight, and they just decided not to go back to Germany. As long as they were here, they liked it better, and they stayed. So, you know, maybe Henry the German's daddy, he would have been a proper age maybe for his daddy to have been a Hessian soldier here and liked the looks of the country and sent for his family. I don't know.
Okay.
I can't tell you about it. That's something y'all can look up. Now, that is the most we can do on your daddy's side of the family.
Okay, now what about Millie Shue?
Millie Shue, that's Amelia, her name is. She's
Okay.
named for her grandmother. You see, John H. Shue Sr.'s wife was
Mhm.
named Amelia. And I think
Okay.
Amelia's a pretty name. I like that. In fact,
Now, how did James Gill, go ahead.
I was gonna say, in fact, John Henry Shue Jr., we found, had a sister named Catherine Amelia. I think that's pretty. She was named for her mother Amelia and her grandmother Catherine.
Okay, how did James G. Anderson meet Millie Shue?
Well, he just drifted down after he got out of the Union Army. You know, those carpetbaggers. He just came on south, and he just met her, and he was a lot older than she was. How much older, Ray? I've got dates and things around here in all my papers, but he was quite a lot older, and I
Well,
expect
just a guesstimate there, just
20 years older,
Okay.
at least. And I suspect, again, kind of like my suspicions about Grandma Jones, this was just a girl who'd grown up with hard times. I mean, her father died when she was young, and she probably had it hard. And here's an older man who's got a leather business, and she married.
Okay, so what happened to Henry Shue? He died.
Henry Shue Jr., he blew up in the crater.
Okay, gotcha. So that left Esther widowed
With some children.
with a bunch of children, one of whom was Millie Shue.
Right, Amelia.
And so here comes James G. Anderson coming down from
An
Baltimore,
older man with prospects, in fact with money, I guess.
and she's on her
And a gold watch.
dead father's farm
Mm-hmm.
with her mother and
Right.
siblings,
Mhm.
and so she marries this guy.
Right,
Okay, and they live where?
at Enochville.
Okay, what did he do in Enochville?
I don't know, nothing much.
He had the leather business?
No,
No,
he
had a
bought,
little
no,
business.
he bought a lot of farmland.
Yeah.
He had a pretty big section of land.
And he's the gentleman that had all the books, and I'd love to know what his books
He-
were.
He was a farmer by the time he got there. He just
Okay.
bought a heck of a lot of farmland around Enochville and farmed, I guess, till he got too old.
And
Okay.
Ray has recalled that he was not terribly fond of Grandma Millie, that he liked his Grandma Butler better. We'll get behind a minute. That Grandma Millie was sort of stubborn.
I can't imagine
Well, that's what he said.
Grim and stuff.
that. And the two of you didn't get along?
Well, anyway, that's the story there. Now,
Okay, her father was Germanic,
hmm
so she may have been a little bit
She
Germanic.
was.
You know,
She was Germanic.
Yeah. Now, I had
Okay.
wondered, this is just a possibility, I mentioned it to Ray, Esther, whose name we don't know, I wonder if Esther could have been named Cohen or Steinberg or something, because she named one of her children Levi.
Oh,
And her name
I
is
didn't mention
Esther.
that name, I wondered about.
I don't know, of course, back then
Back
people,
then, people named their children biblical names.
biblical names, it may not, but it's a
Christian
possibility
names.
that she might have been a Jewish lady, but she may not have been.
So in addition to having a black cousin on your side of the family, we might possibly have a Jewish cousin. on
Right.
your side.
Well,
and our
actually,
Mexican cousins.
And our Mexican cousin.
yeah, you're Mexican guy. Well, actually, you don't descend from him, but one of my grandfather Orr's brothers may have sired a black gentleman who used to come up to my grandmother's, known as Charlie Orr. Yeah, I mean the black gentleman's name, not my grandmother's. Okay, I always figured that was Uncle Bruce's boy, but I don't know. I don't know. They
Just tell
didn't.
them if they think some of your relatives are colored.
I not only have friends,
You're Hispanic, Jewish, and black.
Okay, now James and Millie lived on a farm and had Noah and who else?
They had Noah and Victor and Charlie.
Noah and Victor and Charlie. And what happened to Victor?
He died and he's buried up in Kannapolis, isn't he?
Victor was a big league baseball player.
Yes,
for
he
a
was.
while.
That's true.
Victor,
Oh,
I like to
Yeah, he once knocked a home run over the fence in Birmingham, I'm told.
Who did he
That's
play
a
for?
legend.
Pitcher.
For who?
oh, back then,
I don't know.
I don't know, it was before, it was just
I
after
bet
World War
Cooperstown
I.
has stuff on him.
so he was your Uncle Victor, and he was a ball player.
And he played professional ball.
Oh, yeah.
And when I
Dancing
knew
hero.
him, I was scared to death of him. I was selling advertisements to the Independent to pad out my miserable stipend as a reporter. And I tried selling advertising to him. He nearly bit my head off. That was the most unpleasant person.
What business did he have?
He had a filling station at that
I'll tell you,
time
Where?
in Kannapolis.
So Uncle Victor had a filling station in Kannapolis after he was a ball player.
and I'll tell you what he did one afternoon that
we-
kind of shook up.
Can you just come around, at least come closer, because it's not picking you up, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's directional.
It's directional. Why don't you just sit over there in the corner of the you won't be in the picture,
Yeah. I promise.
but
I
there's
won't
no
do it.
point in telling us, then we have to repeat it.
Well, Uncle Victor had a two-door Ford sedan, Model A. Do you remember what they looked like?
Mm-hmm.
And he came out of the filling station one day and some guy was driving off in it. Zip, zip, zip up the road about 60, 65 miles an hour. And Uncle Victor grabbed some customer who was in the filling station and said, "Take me to chase that guy." So they started chasing him. And Uncle Victor got out of the car and got up on the hood of that car. He said, "Now you motion for me, get on right up behind his car." And they were doing about 60 or 65 down this country road. And the customer did get right up behind Uncle Victor's Model A, and he just jumped over, climbed across the roof, got around on the side, and started beating the fellow in the face, and he pulled over.
Any more anecdotes about Uncle Victor?
I like them.
This was Uncle Victor at the gas station in Kannapolis.
Previous to the ball player.
Ball player who, before he knew you were to be part of the family, didn't
Right,
like
before
you.
I knew I was to be part of the family.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Uncle
Why did
Victor
he like
became a drinking uncle,
Mm-hmm.
but not as much of a drinking uncle as Uncle Charlie.
Oh, tell us about Uncle Charlie.
Uncle Charlie would get locked up in the local jail just casually. Everybody knew him when he'd get pretty drunk. And he had a good job, but he just loved to drink.
What did he do for a living?
He was a foreman over the Cannon Mills. And
Okay.
they liked him so well, they let him get by with this. But the thing that was most remembered about him, the chief of police, Nancy knew the chief.
Yes, it
was
did.
a Chapman,
Sure did. Chief
who had
Chapman.
been chief for years and years and years. But they'd just lead Uncle Charlie around and put him in a cell till he sobered up. He'd be all right for a week or two. But one night he really went on a rampage, and they had a wood-burning stove in the cell. He tore the stove up and almost set the jail on fire and just really raised a ruckus. And they kind of leaned on him a little harder after that.
Is that Grandfather Anderson's brother?
Brother.
Oh.
Yeah.
And
Is that right?
And Grandfather Anderson is so quiet.
I
And
know.
Victor's the other brother.
Yeah.
And Charlie's one brother, and
And
grandfather's the.
I can figure which one thought of cutting the ropes on the tent at the revival. I don't
It
think
wasn't
was-
Grandfather Anderson.
No, that was Uncle Charlie, I'm sure.
Okay, now where's Uncle Charlie buried?
No, Kannapolis?
Oh, somewhere around Kannapolis, I'm not really sure.
So how long was he around?
He died about 15 years, 20 years
Is that right?
ago.
So he was around when I've been around.
Sure.
Well,
So
I
was
didn't know.
Uncle Victor.
Well, I didn't know.
How
that.
come we never
We
met him?
never met.
You never
was
went to
one.
Kannapolis.
We went there every
We
summer.
went every summer.
Remember those trips in the cars? We always went
Over
there,
the
stayed.
Smoky Mountains.
He lived in Florida for a while. He could have been living in Florida.
Uh,
I never even met Uncle Charlie. I heard of it, but
That's
I
your
never
name, was
met
it?
him.
Aunt Helen and grandfather, that was
Huh?
it.
Was he good?
That was
Yeah.
Uncle Victor.
I know
He
Uncle
was a
Victor.
good pitcher. Outstanding.
Well, now-
Did they have
They say he
children?
would have,
Yeah, Ray's got Anderson cousins, but he
So
never.
Charlie and Victor had children,
yeah, in Kannapolis.
and they're in Kannapolis now.
Yeah. We've got names and addresses.
Now, Uncle Jim played baseball too, didn't he?
Yeah, he
that's
played
what I'm
baseball.
wondering, is if there's some latent
Huh.
talent in the family that we need to start.
And Betsy used to play softball, you know. Well, let me, I
Well, Uncle
want
Charlie also played ball, but not as well. I think he played with kind of a semi-pro team.
But Uncle Jim played.
yeah,
he
Oh,
played
yeah,
professional.
Yeah.
he played professional
But
minor
Victor
league.
was the big star. If he
I wanna
hadn't
know
gotten
who
to
he
drinking,
played for.
Who knows?
he would have probably, been a major star.
I'll bet the
Okay, so
Cougars-
your father, my grandfather, was born in Enochville on the farm that James G. Anderson bought.
Correct.
Right.
After the war, James G. Anderson married Millie Shue, had a farm, and had, which is the oldest? Victor, Charlie, and Noah.
Charlie's the old. No, wait a minute. My daddy's the old.
Is it? Are you
Yeah.
sure?
Yeah, and Charlie was second, and Vic the young.
How much younger
Okay.
were your son?
A couple of years.
Oh, okay, they were pretty close.
Very close. There's a picture of all three of them hanging on the wall. up
Yeah,
here.
I know that picture.
Well,
Okay.
I want to tell y'all now about the Butler because I remember Ray's grandma Butler real well, and I really liked her.
Okay.
Okay, I remember Miss Butler. She was a scientist.
Right here.
Yeah, well, Della Butler's mother, Sarah Margaret McLean.
Here's Della
I think
Butler.
the name Sarah Margaret's pretty too.
Okay, so you're going to tell us now about John Butler and Sarah
Sarah
Margaret
Margaret.
McLean and
They
how they
married
wound
each other.
up with Della Butler.
Yeah, plus a whole lot of other children.
But Dale, before you get into this, let me check and see how much tape we have left. This is a 2-hour tape. You think you've been getting close to
We've
that?
got some more tape here.
Okay. Let me take a quick look and just see what we have here.
Troops, I'll be reporting live from Saudi Arabia.
Then from back home, Tom.
Now, Ray's mother, Della Butler, had among her siblings Ray's Uncle Emery, who rode his horse all the way from Enochville to Kannapolis to see Roger when I took Roger to visit when he was a year old, because Uncle Emery said he wanted to see Della's grandson. There you are.
Okay, now, so Della Butler grew up in Enochville.
Right.
And that's how she and Noah Anderson
Right.
knew each other.
Mhm.
Okay.
And Uncle Emery was a World War I hero. He had won what now?
Distinguished Service Cross.
Distinguished Service Cross? Okay, he's won the Distinguished Service Cross because he had single-handedly captured a whole raft of Germans.
32.
Yeah, 32. Okay, kind of like Sergeant York. And Della had a lot of other brothers and sisters, and I can't tick them off. And you got relatives galore scattered around on that side, cousins, well, they're relatives. But Sarah Margaret McLean, Ray's grandmother, was just cute as a bug. She died when she was way up in her 90s, so I knew her when I first got married, and she was still alive when she Helen one night when she and Johnny had a date. Johnny said, "Grandma, you want to go to the picture show?" Miss Butler, she says, "Sure." She goes and gets a hat, and then Helen has to explain she can't go because she can't see the screen. She had a farm out near Enochville, and she was married to John Butler, who was sheriff of, it would be Rowan County, wouldn't it, or would it be Iredell? Which one of them? Okay, Rowan County. And he was murdered. One night he went out on a case of some kind, and he didn't come home, and the next morning his buggy came home with his body tied in the buggy wheel.
In what year was that?
That was 1894.
1894. Okay.
And leaving the widow with a number of children. And according to family legend, the lynch mob formed. They figured that he was a popular sheriff, and they figured they knew who'd done it. And Mrs. Butler went out with a gun and stopped them. Said, "Try him and then hang him," or whatever. So I don't know whether that story is absolutely true or not, but it probably is. I heard it quite a bit. And
Did they hang the guy?
Do you know what they
No,
do
he
with
left
it?
town.
Well, does he have descendants we could find?
Hang them?
I mean,
It's in the courthouse record somewhere. Look them up.
Might be a big settlement due us and we're not aware of.
yeah, or maybe someone we should go over and kill.
And Miss
Got
Butler,
the skin to tan.
Really?
Ray's grandmother, Miss Butler, had only one real peculiarity when I knew her. She was sure she had pellagra. Now that's a disease white trash gets, isn't it? She was up in the 90s, and she was just sure she had pellagra, and the doctors all said she had no such thing, but they give her yeast in a special container, which she thought was her pellagra medicine. She didn't know what she was taking, and she was very conscientious about taking her pellagra medicine so she wouldn't die of pellagra. And I think Ray and I probably can on the McLean side.
It worked. She didn't die of pellagra.
No, she didn't die of pellagra. Because if we go back to my McLean branch a bit, we get back to Mooresville, North Carolina, and Sarah Margaret McLean's family were also from around there. In fact, she's buried at Prospect Church near Mooresville right now.
This one has directions on her family.
Yeah, she's got a picture of it. Now, Sarah Margaret's father was William Burton McLean, and her mother, Jane Isabella Graham. I think the women in her side...
Here it has Jane Isabella Cochran.
Jane Isabella Cochran's what I meant. I skipped one. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so here's Sarah Margaret McLean.
Uh-huh. William Burton
John
McLean.
Butler. This is the sheriff
Mhm.
and his wife. And they lived in Enochville.
Around Mooresville and Enochville, kind of.
Okay.
3 or 4 miles out of town.
Okay, so they lived around Enochville.
Oh, yeah.
And James G. Anderson and Millie
Correct.
Shue lived around
They
Enochville.
all-
And that's how Noah met Della.
Correct.
Okay, and now we're talking about Sarah's parents.
Yeah, Jane Isabella Cochran, you're right, I skipped a generation.
Okay.
And she married William Burton McLean, and they're buried up there at Prospect Church too. And William McLean's tombstone has his name spelled wrong. They have it spelled M-C-L-A-N-E or something. And I asked Ray how they happened to spell his great-grandpa's name wrong on the tombstone. He said, oh, somebody just went in and said, old man Burt McLean died, make him a tombstone. So the man carving the tombstone didn't ask how to spell his name, and that's how they spelled it. And you will notice as we go back down my family, there are many William McLeans and many Williams here, so there's got to be a connection. William McLean's father, William Burton, was also William McLean, who died in 1860 at the age of 69. And he was married to Sarah Burton Graham. So we know where William Burton McLean got that Burton. It comes from his mother's name. She was Sarah Burton Graham. And it is possible that her mother was a Burton. We don't know. But sometimes when a name goes down a family like that, somebody had it somewhere. These Burtons.
Okay, so what about William Burton McLean? What did he do occupationally? And,
I don't know unless he just farmed, I guess. Everybody farmed.
okay, whereabouts?
Around Enochville and around Mooresville and Enochville.
Between Enochville and Mooresville, all of that farm land through there is McLean and
Okay.
Now, when you get up into the cemeteries up in that section, just like they're all German over toward Mount Pleasant, the other side of Concord, when you get up around Mooresville and Enochville, well, past Enochville, Scottish, solid Scottish names. And Center Church up there, of which Elizabeth has a picture, one of the founders of Center Church and one of the builders of the original log church was my ancestor, Ephraim McLean. He lived in that same county. And the reason being all these McLeans and Scots, there are many. Graham, that's a Scottish name, Cochran, Scottish, Fleming, Jamison, all Scots. After Bonnie Prince Charlie's rise in the 45, you remember Inverness where he was defeated, we saw the
Okay.
McLean hit grave where the Klansmen were buried.
That's 1745.
Yeah, 1745. The Scots, mostly Highland Scots, who had supported Bonnie Prince Charlie, if they could get away, they left. Because if they stayed, they were either one, executed, which is what they did to most of them, or sold into slavery, which actually happened. A lot of Scots were sold as slaves to the Barbados. And eventually they, fortunately, were bought by other Scots in North Carolina. But a lot of Scots in North Carolina as a result of that. In fact, what's the name who saved Bonnie Prince Charlie? My mind has failed. I know her name is Flora MacDonald, who dressed Bonnie Prince Charlie as her maid and helped him escape the British. She wound up in North Carolina.
it's a college.
Yeah, this Flora MacDonald College there, named for the young lady who saved Bonnie Prince Charlie. So, Scots all over the place there.